20 years ago, my 8th grade teacher looked at my mother and said, "Some kids are just born for the bottom." My mom cried in the school parking lot. Decades later, that same teacher stood on a stage waiting to cut the ribbon on a brand new academy. She smiled for the cameras holding the giant gold scissors. She had no idea I held the deed to the building, the eviction notice in my pocket, and the remote to turn off the microphone she was speaking into. The sound of thick parchment tearing in half echoed through the Boston City Hall chambers. Councilwoman Beatrice Sterling held the remnants of my zoning application over the wastebasket beside her leather chair and let them fall. She adjusted her designer reading glasses and leaned into her microphone. The red light blinked on. "You clean up well?" Savannah Beatrice said, her voice carrying that familiar patronizing lilt I remembered from middle school. "But a free academy for autistic children in the historic district is a waste of prime real estate. We need tax revenue, not a charity ward. Education is simply not for your tax bracket. Do not overreach." A ripple of low chuckles moved through the gallery. The rows behind me were packed with wealthy donors and board members of Sterling Prep, the elite private academy. Beatrice ran when she was not sitting on the city council. My jaw tightened. I gripped the edges of the oak podium so hard my knuckles ached. "I secured a $5 million federal grant for this project," I stated, keeping my tone level despite the heat rising in my chest. "The funding requires a zoned location by Friday. This vacant lot has been sitting empty for 4 years." Beatrice smiled a thin, razor-sharp curve of her lips. "Not anymore. The council took a vote this morning prior to open session. We have awarded the parcel to Sterling Prep. Our students need a new golf practice green. The decision is final." She hit her wooden gavel against the sound block. The loud crack signaled the death of 2 years of my grueling work. Beatrice looked down at me from her elevated seat. It was the exact same look she gave me when I was 14 years old, wearing secondhand clothes and failing her history class. A look of pure, unfiltered disgust. "You are dismissed," she ordered, waving her hand toward the exit. I stood frozen. The federal grant money would evaporate in 48 hours without a physical address. Hundreds of kids waiting for specialized resources would get nothing, so teenagers in Argyle sweaters could practice their putting. The injustice sat heavy in my throat. I gathered my remaining folders, refusing to give Beatrice or her country club audience the satisfaction of seeing me break. Just as I turned away from the podium, my phone vibrated inside my blazer pocket. I pulled it out, intending to silence it. A text message flashed across the screen from my mother, Helen. 3 simple words that made the blood freeze in my veins. "Please help me." My mother never asked for help. She worked back-breaking shifts her entire life and suffered in silence. I shoved the phone into my pocket and sprinted down the center aisle of the chamber, pushing past the smirking donors. Beatrice called out something mocking as the heavy wooden doors swung shut behind me, but I did not stop to listen. My life work was unraveling in that room, but whatever was happening to my mother was worse. "My name is Savannah Pierce. I am 35 years old, and I run an educational nonprofit. Before I tell you how I dismantled the most prestigious private school in Boston, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe arrogance always comes with a receipt." I slammed my foot against the warped front door of my mother's house. The rusted hinges gave way with a loud crunch, hitting the interior wall. My chest heaved as I stepped into the cramped living room. Shards of glass covered the faded floral rug. My mother Helen knelt among the debris. Blood trickled from a small cut on her palm as she tried to gather the shattered remains of our only family portrait. Standing on the worn sofa, wearing pristine beige slacks and clutching a quilted Chanel bag, was my older sister Julianne. She looked down at our mother with a sneer of pure revulsion. Julianne was the golden child, the one my mother scraped pennies together to send to dance camps and private tutors, while I wore hand-me-down winter coats. Julianne married a corporate vice president and spent her days attending charity luncheons pretending she never grew up in this neighborhood. Julianne flicked her wrist. A thick stack of legal papers hit Helen square in the chest, scattering across the floorboards. "Pick it up, you pathetic old woman," Julianne spat. "You owe me this. I gave up my youth living in this dump. Now it is time this property actually serves a purpose." I rushed forward, kicking the glass away to shield my mother. I grabbed Julianne by the ankle and yanked her off the sofa. She stumbled, landing hard on her designer heels. "Do not ever speak to her like that," I warned, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "What is going on here?" Julianne straightened her silk blouse, unbothered by my anger. She picked up the top page of the document and shoved it into my face. I took a home equity line of credit against this worthless shack, $150,000. The funds transferred this morning. I stared at the bold print at the top of the page. The lender was a subsidiary bank, but the destination of the wire transfer made my blood run cold. Sterling Preparatory Academy. "You mortgaged our mother's only shelter to pay Beatrice Sterling," I demanded. The sheer audacity of her greed suffocated the air in the room. Julianne scoffed, adjusting her diamond tennis bracelet. "It is called an elite endowment, Savannah. It secures my son a spot in the incoming kindergarten class and buys me a guaranteed seat on the Parent-Teacher Association board. Beatrice Sterling only deals with the right kind of people. I have to elevate my child into the upper echelon. I cannot have him associated with failures like you." The realization hit me hard. Beatrice had just stripped my foundation of its zoning permit, and now my own sister was funding Beatrice's vanity project, using my mother's home as collateral. The two women who despised me most were feeding off each other. I dropped to my knees and picked up the signature page. I studied the ink. My mother has severe rheumatoid arthritis. Her hands shake when she holds a pen. The signature on this bank guarantee was fluid, sharp, and heavy. It also included a middle initial my mother never used on legal forms. "This is a forgery," I stated, looking up at Julianne. "You forged a bank guarantee. That is a federal crime." Julianne threw her head back and let out a sharp, cruel laugh. "Prove it." She leaned in close, the cloying scent of her expensive perfume masking the smell of the damp carpet. "I will tell the authorities she signed it willingly to help her successful daughter. I will tell them she is losing her mind and forgetting her own actions. Who do you think they will believe, Savannah? A fake charity director who just got humiliated at City Hall, or a high society mother with an immaculate record?" Helen wept silently, gripping my jacket sleeve. "Please, Savannah," she whispered. "Where will I go? I have nothing left." Julianne glared at the frail woman on the floor. "You have 30 days to vacate before the bank initiates foreclosure. Start packing your junk. I am not letting a prime networking opportunity slip away just because you want to hoard a rotting house. You are not getting away with this," I promised, stepping toward my sister. "I will drag you into a courtroom. I will pull the notary records. I will subpoena the loan officer. I will rip your perfect suburban life apart piece by piece." Heavy tires crunched against the gravel driveway outside. The flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser cast harsh shadows across the living room walls. Julianne smiled a predatory grin that chilled me to the bone. "You really think you can fight me in this town?" she taunted. "My husband plays golf with the people who run this county. You are nothing but a nuisance." Heavy footsteps pounded onto the porch. The local sheriff pushed through the broken front door. He did not look at the shattered glass. He did not look at my bleeding mother on the floor. His uniform was crisp, his badge catching the glare of the cruiser lights. He tipped his hat to Julianne. "Is there a problem here, Mrs. Hayes?" he asked, his tone dripping with practiced courtesy reserved for the wealthy. Julianne pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. "Yes, Sheriff. My unstable sister just broke in and is threatening me over a legal financial transaction my mother approved. I want her removed from the premises immediately. She is trespassing and causing a disturbance." The sheriff turned his attention to me. His hand rested casually on his utility belt. "You need to step outside right now, Miss Pierce." I held up the forged document. "She committed wire fraud," I argued, keeping my ground. "Look at the signature. It is a fake. She stole this house." The sheriff did not even glance at the paper. "I am not a judge or a bank teller," he said coldly. "This is a civil matter. But breaking down a door and threatening a respected member of this community is a criminal offense. Step outside or I will place you under arrest for assault and trespassing." Julianne stood behind him, smirking victorious. She had engineered the perfect trap. She stole the house, secured her social status at Sterling Prep, and brought law enforcement to ensure I could not fight back. If I threw a punch, I would go to jail and lose the federal grant forever. If I stayed silent, my mother would be homeless. I looked at Helen trembling on the floor. Her tear-stained face begged me not to make things worse. I looked at the forged signature on the paper. Then I looked at the sheriff acting as a personal bodyguard for a thief. The corruption ran deep. Julianne thought she held all the cards. She thought her country club connections made her untouchable. I folded the bank document carefully and shoved it into my blazer pocket. "I am leaving," I said, staring dead into Julianne's eyes. "But this piece of paper stays with me." Julianne frowned, her smug expression faltering for a fraction of a second. "Give that back. It belongs to me." "Actually, it belongs to the bank," I replied, stepping past the sheriff. "And soon it will belong to a forensic handwriting expert. Enjoy your new PTA seat, Julianne. You are going to need a lot of powerful friends when the federal indictment arrives." I walked out the front door into the cool evening air. The flashing police lights illuminated the dilapidated exterior of the house I grew up in. My mind raced, tracing through a maze of legal codes, grant stipulations, and financial retaliation tactics. Beatrice Sterling took my school. Julianne took my mother's house to fund Beatrice. They were connected by greed and arrogance. I climbed into my car and gripped the steering wheel until my hands went numb. I had 48 hours to find a new location for my autism academy or forfeit $5 million. I had 30 days to save my mother from eviction. The law was currently standing in my mother's living room protecting the criminal. I could not rely on the local police. I could not rely on fairness. I started the engine and threw the car into drive. If Julianne and Beatrice wanted to use money and status to crush people they deemed beneath them, I would have to play a different game. I would not fight them in a courtroom where they could buy the judge. I would find their financial weakness and bleed them dry. My sister wanted into the elite circle. I was going to burn that circle to the ground. The wrought iron gates of Sterling Preparatory Academy loomed ahead, wrapped in climbing ivy and centuries of unearned privilege. I parked my battered sedan half a block away from the valet stand where luxury SUVs lined the circular driveway. Tonight was the annual Founders Gala. The entire local elite, the same people who sat in the city council chamber that morning, were inside drinking champagne and congratulating each other on stealing my land. I had exactly 48 hours to secure a property for my foundation, but my immediate crisis was the bank foreclosure Julianne had initiated against my mother. I needed leverage. I needed to force Beatrice to withdraw the lien. I pushed through the heavy mahogany doors into the grand foyer. The air smelled of expensive floral arrangements and roasted duck. Classical music drifted from the main ballroom. I adjusted my blazer, preparing to corner Beatrice near the silent auction tables. Instead, a scene near the cloakroom brought me to a dead halt. The blood roared in my ears, drowning out the string quartet. My mother Helen was standing behind the heavy wooden coat check counter. She wore a stiff, ill-fitting gray uniform shirt that hung loosely over her frail frame. Her hands, severely swollen and twisted by rheumatoid arthritis, fumbled as she tried to hang a heavy cashmere overcoat on a wooden hanger. A young man in a tuxedo sighed loudly, checking his Rolex, waiting for his claim ticket. Helen dropped the hanger. It clattered against the marble floor. She let out a small gasp of pain, cradling her inflamed joints. I started moving toward her, but someone else reached the counter first. Julianne. My sister, wearing a backless emerald evening gown, stepped into the cloakroom area. She did not help our mother retrieve the fallen hanger. Instead, she leaned across the counter and hissed, "You are embarrassing me. I pulled strings to get you a shift here so you could earn some extra cash for your moving expenses. Move faster. The Henderson family is watching." I broke into a run. Before I could reach the counter, the heavy oak doors of the main ballroom swung open. Beatrice Sterling emerged, surrounded by a flock of wealthy parents. She wore a tailored crimson suit, holding a crystal flute filled with red wine. She spotted Julianne and smiled that predatory, terrifying smile. "Ah, Mrs. Hayes," Beatrice purred, floating toward the cloakroom. "I see your mother is adapting well to her new socioeconomic reality. It is so important for the lower classes to understand the value of honest labor." Helen kept her head bowed, her trembling hands gripping the edge of the counter for support. Julianne offered a sickeningly sweet smile, practically vibrating with the desperation for approval. "Thank you for the opportunity, Beatrice. My family believes in earning our keep." Beatrice stepped closer to the counter, swirling the dark red liquid in her glass. She looked down at my mother, observing her struggle to breathe through the physical pain. It was a calculated assessment. Beatrice raised her glass as if to offer a toast. Then, with a deliberate flick of her wrist, she tilted the crystal flute. The dark burgundy wine cascaded over the edge, splashing directly onto the toes of my mother's worn orthopedic shoes and pooling onto the pristine marble floor. "Oh, dear," Beatrice gasped, feigning shock. "How clumsy of me. Be a dear, Helen, and clean that up before one of our major donors slips. We cannot have a liability lawsuit on top of a foreclosure, can we?" Helen slowly lowered herself toward the floor. Her knees popped audibly in the quiet foyer. She reached into the pocket of her uniform for a rag, her face pale and tight with humiliation. Julianne stood 2 feet away watching our mother kneel in spilled wine and did absolutely nothing. I shattered the distance between us. I grabbed the edge of the heavy wooden coat check counter and vaulted over it, landing between Beatrice and my mother. I kicked the empty crystal flute out of Beatrice's hand. It shattered against the wall, raining glass onto the plush carpet. "Do not touch her," I commanded, pulling Helen back up to her feet. I wrapped my arm tightly around my mother's trembling shoulders, shielding her from the absolute depravity of the 2 women standing before us. Beatrice did not flinch at the shattering glass. She simply smiled, retrieving a wireless microphone from the podium near the ballroom entrance. She tapped the grill once. A sharp feedback whine cut through the Gala silence. Conversation stopped. 200 wealthy donors turned their heads toward the cloakroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," Beatrice announced, her voice echoing through the massive hall, "please direct your attention to the foyer. It seems one of our former troubled students, Savannah Pierce, has decided to join our custodial staff for the evening. Let us give her a round of applause for finally finding a career suited to her pedigree." Laughter rippled through the crowd. I recognized city council members, bank executives, and local politicians grinning at the spectacle. They whispered behind their hands, pointing at my worn blazer and my mother's stained uniform. Julianne stepped away from the counter, creating distance between herself and our public humiliation. I glared at Beatrice, refusing to let the heat rising in my cheeks break my composure. "You stole my zoning permit this morning, Beatrice," I said, my voice low, but carrying a lethal edge. "And tonight your new PTA pet Julianne forged a bank document to steal my mother's house. You are running a cartel disguised as a prep school. Withdraw the foreclosure lien right now." Beatrice lowered the microphone, holding it loosely at her side. She stepped closer, entering my personal space. The scent of her expensive perfume was nauseating. "You really do not understand how the world works, do you, Savannah?" she whispered. "The lien is held by a subsidiary bank controlled by one of my board members. I can have the foreclosure processed by Monday morning. Your mother will be sleeping on a park bench before the streetlights come on." I tightened my grip on Helen. "What do you want?" Beatrice's eyes gleamed with dark, predatory triumph. "I want the $5 million federal grant you secured. The funds are sitting in a federal escrow account waiting for you to designate a building. Sterling Preparatory Academy is currently launching a capital campaign to build a new indoor aquatic center. We could use that kind of loose change. You want me to sign over a federal grant meant for autistic children, so you can build a swimming pool for rich kids?" I asked, the sheer evil of her demand suffocating the air in the room. "That money is strictly earmarked for special needs education. You cannot touch it." Beatrice waved a manicured hand dismissively. "My attorneys are very creative, Savannah. We will establish a small part-time tutoring program in the basement to satisfy the federal diversity requirements. I just need you as the primary grant applicant to sign the transfer authorization form, relinquishing your administrative control to our foundation." She reached into her crimson jacket and pulled out a folded legal document. She smoothed it out on the coat check counter, right over the puddle of spilled wine. She uncapped a heavy gold fountain pen and placed it beside the paper. "You have a choice," Beatrice said, her voice loud enough for Julianne and the nearest guests to hear. "Sign over the grant, and I will make a phone call to halt the foreclosure on this miserable woman's house. Refuse, and I will personally ensure the sheriff's department physically drags her out of her home on Monday. I hear the homeless shelters are at maximum capacity this time of year." The trap snapped shut. My chest heaved as I looked at the legal transfer document. $5 million. 2 years of navigating bureaucratic red tape, begging politicians for funding and building a curriculum designed to save marginalized children. All of it sitting on the table waiting to be handed over to a woman who enjoyed pouring wine on crippled women for sport. If I signed the paper, my dream was dead. The children who needed that school would get nothing. But if I refused, the woman trembling in my arms, the woman who had sacrificed everything for me, would lose the only shelter she had left. Julianne watched me from the corner. Her arms crossed, a look of smug satisfaction plastered across her face. She had finally won. She had sacrificed our mother to secure her place in the country club, and I was the one paying the bill. I reached out and picked up the heavy gold pen. The metal felt cold against my skin. I looked at the signature line. The weight of the moment threatened to crush my spine. I was entirely alone, outmaneuvered by generational wealth and coordinated corruption. There was no legal loophole. There was no dramatic rescue. The pen hovered over the paper. "Sign it." Savannah Beatrice ordered, her voice dripping with cruel victory. "Sign it and go back to the gutter where you belong." I pressed the nib of the pen against the paper, a tiny drop of dark blue ink bleeding into the fibers. I closed my eyes, preparing to surrender my entire life's work to save my mother's life. "Stop right there." A sharp, authoritative voice sliced through the tension of the foyer. The command was not loud, but it carried a specific, undeniable weight of corporate authority. The heavy mahogany front doors swung open, and the cool night air rushed into the stuffy entrance hall. I opened my eyes, pulling the pen away from the paper. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the streetlights, was a woman I had never met. She wore a razor-sharp charcoal suit and carried a thick leather briefcase. Her presence instantly altered the atmospheric pressure in the room. Beatrice turned, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second before reforming into a mask of polite confusion. The woman stepped into the foyer, her heels clicking decisively against the marble floor. The battle was not over. It had just begun. The woman in the charcoal suit did not wait for an invitation. She walked straight past the security guards at the entrance. Her heels struck the marble floor with the precision of a metronome. I recognized the sharp profile and the unyielding posture immediately. It was Maya. My youngest brother Liam had married her 5 years ago. Maya was a senior audit director at Deloitte. She spent her days dissecting corporate fraud and burying corrupt executives under mountains of their own financial data. Maya reached the coat check counter. She did not look at Julianne. She did not acknowledge the murmuring crowd of donors in the background. Her dark eyes locked onto Beatrice. Maya reached out and clamped her hand over my wrist, stopping the gold fountain pen an inch above the signature line. "Put the pen down," Savannah Maya ordered. Her voice was calm, but carried the weight of a gavel striking a sound block. Beatrice stiffened. Her polite mask slipped, revealing the raw irritation underneath. "Excuse me," Beatrice snapped. "This is a private charity gala. Security will escort you out." Maya released my wrist and picked up the transfer document. She looked at the federal grant relinquishment form with pure clinical distaste. "I am Maya Pierce," she stated. "I am also the senior auditor who spent the last 4 hours reviewing the public tax filings of the Sterling Preparatory Foundation. If you call security, I will call the regional director of the Internal Revenue Service and explain the fascinating irregularities in your commercial property depreciation schedules." The color drained from Beatrice's face. The threat was highly specific and struck a nerve. She opened her mouth, but the usual venom failed to materialize. Maya did not wait for a response. She gripped the edges of the heavy parchment paper and tore the transfer authorization straight down the middle. The loud rip echoed in the quiet foyer. Maya tossed the torn halves onto the spilled wine. Julianne finally stepped forward, her face flushed red with indignation. "You have no right to interfere here," Julianne spat. "Savannah owes us this." Maya turned her head slowly. She looked at Julianne the way a scientist looks at a particularly unappealing insect. "Julianne Hayes." Maya said, her tone dropping to a whisper that cut through the air. "Your husband is currently drowning in offshore margin calls. If you speak to me again, I will freeze his remaining shell accounts before you finish your champagne. Step aside." Julianne recoiled, her mouth snapping shut. She took a physical step back, bumping against the coat check counter. Maya grabbed my arm and wrapped her other hand gently around Helen's shoulder. "Let us go," Maya said, guiding us away from the stunned elite. We walked out of the heavy mahogany doors, leaving Beatrice and Julianne stranded in their own humiliated silence. The crisp night air hit my face. My lungs expanded, drawing in oxygen for the first time in an hour. We reached my battered sedan parked down the street. I helped Helen into the back seat. She curled into the worn upholstery, exhausted and trembling. I climbed into the driver's seat. Maya slid into the passenger side and dropped her heavy leather briefcase onto the floorboard. She unclasped the lock and pulled out a thick stack of printed spreadsheets, flagged with neon sticky notes. She tossed the dossier onto the dashboard. It landed with a heavy thud. "What is this?" I asked, staring at the endless rows of numbers and highlighted cells. Maya adjusted her blazer. She did not offer sympathy. She offered strategy. "Look at the balance sheet, Savannah. Look at the red ink. You think an elite private school needs to foreclose on a rusted single-family home to survive. You think Beatrice Sterling cares about a $150,000 home equity line of credit." I flipped open the first page. The numbers made no sense. Sterling Prep charged exorbitant tuition. They hosted millionaire galas. But the operational accounts listed on the paper showed zero liquidity. They were hemorrhaging cash. "They are bankrupt," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. Maya nodded, her eyes cold and sharp in the dim light of the street lamps. "Beatrice is running on fumes. She is leveraging everything. Julianne forcing your mother into a fraudulent bank loan was not about securing a seat on the Parent-Teacher Association. Julianne and her husband needed immediate cash to cover a missing payment to Beatrice." I shook my head, trying to connect the missing pieces. "Why does Julianne owe Beatrice money?" Maya tapped a manicured finger against a complex flowchart on the second page. "Because Sterling Preparatory Academy is not just a school, it is a washing machine. Julianne's husband develops luxury condominiums. He takes investor capital to build these high-rise properties. But the buildings stay empty. They are ghost projects. He funnels the illicit development funds through the school charitable donation portal. Beatrice cleans the dirty money through synthetic vendor invoices and takes a 20% cut for her trouble." The scale of the corruption was staggering. My own sister was married to a fraudster, and they were using the city's most prestigious educational institution to hide their stolen wealth. "The real estate market dipped 3 months ago." Maya continued, her voice maintaining that rapid clinical precision. "Julianne's husband missed a margin call. His investors demanded returns. Beatrice demanded her laundering fee. Julianne panicked. She needed cash instantly to bridge the gap and keep Beatrice from exposing them both. That is why Julianne stole your mother's house today. It was a desperate grab for liquidity." I stared at the torn pieces of the grant authorization form still sitting in my blazer pocket. "Then why does Beatrice want my federal grant?" "Because the bank holding the commercial mortgage on the Sterling Prep campus is demanding payment," Maya explained. "Beatrice owes them $3 million by the end of the month. If she defaults, the bank seizes the school property. They will audit the internal books. The money laundering scheme will be exposed. Julianne's husband goes to prison. Beatrice goes to prison." The truth settled over me. The terror that had gripped my chest all day evaporated. Beatrice did not want my $5 million grant to build a swimming pool. She needed it to save her own life. I held the only life raft in an ocean of debt. My breathing slowed. The frantic beat of my heart shifted into a steady, deliberate rhythm. The power dynamic in the room back there was an illusion. Beatrice was a cornered animal pretending to be a predator. My hands stopped shaking. I looked at my mother resting quietly in the back seat. Then I looked at the financial blueprints mapping the destruction of my enemies. The despair I felt 5 minutes ago vanished entirely, replaced by a cold, calculating intent. They tried to leave my mother on the street to cover their crimes. They smiled while pouring wine on her shoes. I turned to Maya. "How do we break them?" Maya let out a low, sharp laugh. "I was hoping you would ask that." She pulled a final document from her briefcase. "This is the commercial note for the Sterling Prep campus. It is currently held by Vanguard Financial. Vanguard considers this a high-risk, toxic asset because Beatrice has missed 3 consecutive payments. Banks hate toxic assets. They want to offload them quickly." Maya leaned closer. "You have spent the last 2 years building relationships with venture capitalists in Silicon Valley to fund your autism programs. You know people who move mountains of capital before breakfast. We set up an anonymous shell company tonight. You leverage your network to secure a short-term bridge loan. We buy the commercial debt from Vanguard at a steep discount." I stared at the paper, visualizing the trap. If I own the debt, I own the mortgage. If I own the mortgage, I am Beatrice's primary creditor. I hold the power to foreclose on her. Maya smiled. Her teeth gleamed in the shadows. Do not just defend yourself, Savannah. Do not just take your mother's house back. We are going to buy that debt. We are going to call in the loan. We are going to steal her entire school." The engine of my sedan idled quietly in the dark. The pieces were all on the board. The plan was flawless, legal, and entirely lethal. Beatrice Sterling thought she could crush me to save her empire. She had no idea she just handed me the keys to the kingdom. I shifted the car into drive. The counterattack had officially begun. I slammed the door of my beat-up sedan, the metallic thud echoing in the empty street. It was 1:00 a.m. Helen was safe in the back seat, wrapped in my oversized coat, exhausted and silent. Maya sat in the passenger seat, the glow of her laptop illuminating her sharp features. We didn't drive home. We drove to a 24-hour diner on the edge of town, a place with flickering neon lights and bottomless coffee. We needed an operational base, and we needed it now. We slid into a cracked vinyl booth. Helen rested her head against the window, her breathing shallow. Maya didn't offer comforting words. She didn't hold my hand. She flipped open the dossier she had taken from her briefcase and slapped it onto the sticky Formica table. "Look at this," Savannah Maya ordered, pointing a manicured finger at a spreadsheet covered in red ink. "This is the financial reality of Sterling Preparatory Academy." I leaned in, squinting at the numbers. The columns detailed a labyrinth of loans, staggered payments, and ballooning interest rates. It was a house of cards built on a foundation of quicksand. "They owe Vanguard Financial $3 million. Maya explained, her voice low and clinical. "It is a commercial mortgage backed by the school's historic property." Beatrice missed her last 3 payments. Vanguard classified this as a distressed asset yesterday morning. Banks despise distressed assets. They ruin quarterly reports. They attract federal regulators. Vanguard wants this debt off their books immediately. My mind raced, connecting the dots. Julianne stealing Mom's house. The sudden urgency. Julianne didn't mortgage the house to buy a PTA seat. She mortgaged it to pay Beatrice, and Beatrice needed that money to appease Vanguard. Exactly, Maya confirmed, reading my realization. Julianne's husband is running a shadow real estate scheme. Beatrice uses the school's charitable status to wash his dirty money. But the market tanked. He missed a payment. Now Beatrice is facing foreclosure, which means a deep forensic audit by Vanguard. An audit would expose the money laundering. Beatrice isn't trying to steal your $5 million federal grant to build a pool. She needs that grant to pay off the bank and save herself from federal prison. The desperation I felt an hour ago evaporated, replaced by a cold, searing clarity. Beatrice wasn't a predator. She was a drowning woman grasping at my life raft, willing to drown my mother to stay afloat. "How do we use this?" I asked the diner, coffee burning the back of my throat. Maya's eyes glinted in the dim light. "We don't just use it. We weaponize it. You spent 2 years pitching educational models to Silicon Valley venture capitalists. You know, people who move liquid capital before breakfast. We are going to form a blind shell company tonight. We are going to approach Vanguard Financial anonymously and buy Beatrice's debt at a steep discount." I stared at Maya, the magnitude of the plan settling in. "If I own the debt, I own the mortgage. If I own the mortgage, you own Sterling Prep." Maya finished, a razor-sharp smile playing on her lips. "You become Beatrice Sterling's worst nightmare, her primary creditor." I pulled out my phone. It was 1:45 a.m. in Boston, which meant it was 10:45 p.m. in Palo Alto. I dialed Elias Thorne. Elias managed a ruthless private equity firm. He didn't care about charity. He cared about disruptive market acquisitions and high-yield returns. He answered on the third ring, the sound of a crowded restaurant in the background. "Savannah, Elias," said, his voice clipped. "I saw the city council vote online. You lost the zoning permit. Tell me you have a backup location, or I am retracting my initial funding by Friday." "I don't need your initial funding, Elias," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I need a short-term bridge loan, $2.2 million, liquid, wired into a blind escrow account by 6:00 a.m. EST. The background noise faded as he stepped outside. $2.2 million requires board approval. "Savannah, I don't write blank checks for failed projects." "This isn't a failed project," I countered, my tone hardening. "This is a hostile acquisition of a distressed commercial asset. Sterling Preparatory Academy holds a $3 million note with Vanguard Financial. They are in default. Vanguard is desperate to offload the toxic debt before their quarterly earnings call tomorrow. I am going to buy that note at a discount. If you float the capital, I secure the building. You get your money back with a 15% premium the moment I refinance the property under my foundation." Elias was silent, calculating the margins. A prime piece of historic Boston real estate acting as collateral for a discounted note. It was an arbitrage dream. "Who is structuring the acquisition?" He asked, a hint of respect creeping into his voice. "I have a senior audit director from Deloitte sitting across from me," I said, watching Maya's fingers fly across her keyboard. "We are registering a Delaware limited liability company right now. Total anonymity. Vanguard will never know they are selling the debt to me. Send me the term sheet," Elias ordered. "You will have your wire by sunrise." He hung up. Maya didn't miss a beat. She navigated the Delaware Division of Corporations portal with lethal efficiency. Within 30 minutes, Vanguard EdTech LLC existed on paper. It had an employer identification number, a registered agent, and a blank operating agreement. It was a ghost entity designed for one specific execution. At 4:00 a.m., Maya initiated contact with the commercial debt restructuring desk at Vanguard Financial. She bypassed standard channels using her corporate credentials to wake a senior vice president. The negotiation was swift, brutal, and devoid of emotion. Maya leveraged Vanguard's fear of a messy, high-profile foreclosure involving an elite school. She offered them a clean, silent exit. $2.1 million cash for a $3 million note. The bank executive agreed before the sun breached the horizon. At 6:15 a.m., the wire transfer from Elias Thorne cleared the escrow account. At 7:30 a.m., Vanguard executed the assignment of the deed of trust. Maya downloaded the final PDF and turned the laptop around. The black text on the white background was definitive. Vanguard Financial had officially surrendered their position. Vanguard EdTech LLC was the new primary creditor. I stared at the document. My chest rose and fell in a slow, measured rhythm. 24 hours ago, I stood at a podium begging a corrupt city council for a piece of abandoned dirt. Now I owned the mortgage to the most exclusive private school in the state. I held the legal right to seize the very ground Beatrice Sterling walked on. I owned the walls, the classrooms, the grand foyer, and the cloakroom where they humiliated my mother. I kept my mouth shut. Silence was my heaviest weapon. I did not text Julianne. I did not issue public threats. Let them sleep in their expensive beds, believing they had won. We drove back to my apartment. The morning light cast long shadows across the empty streets. I brewed a pot of cheap coffee and drank it black. My mind was a steel trap. Every emotion, every ounce of betrayal from my sister was locked away, replaced by cold, strategic intent. At 8:45 a.m., my phone buzzed on the counter. An email notification. The sender was Beatrice Sterling. Julianne was copied on the thread. The subject line read, "Final Notice and Grant Transfer Protocols." I tapped the screen and opened the message. The tone was exactly what I expected. Arrogant, dripping with false civility, and backed by the threat of immediate ruin. "Savannah," the email began, "I trust you, and your mother had a restful night after your little theatrical display at the Gala. As we discussed, you will arrive at my office at 3:00 p.m. this afternoon. You will bring the federal grant authorization forms. You will sign the relinquishment giving my foundation administrative control of the $5 million. In exchange, I will instruct Julianne to halt the foreclosure on the property." There was an attachment at the bottom of the email. I clicked the thumbnail image. It was a high-resolution photograph taken just moments ago. It showed the rusted chain-link fence outside my mother's small house. Idling right at the curb was a heavy-duty commercial tow truck. Standing next to the truck drinking a coffee was a contractor wearing a neon vest holding a clipboard. Julianne had sent a property clearing crew to wait outside the house. It was a visual threat, a reminder that if I defied them, they would drag Helen's belongings onto the street before sunset. They wanted me terrified. They wanted me walking into that 3:00 p.m. meeting broken weeping and desperate to surrender my life's work. They thought the tow truck was their winning card. I looked at the photo. 24 hours ago, that image would have sent me into a blind panic. I would have folded. I would have sacrificed the academy to protect my mother. But looking at it now, the photograph was nothing more than digital evidence of extortion. It was a receipt for the trap they built for themselves. I tapped the reply button. I did not draft a paragraph pleading for mercy. I did not try to negotiate terms. I did not mention the Delaware Corporation or the bank transfer. I typed a single word, agreed. I hit send. I pictured Beatrice sitting in her plush leather chair reading that one word. I pictured Julianne smirking at her phone, believing she had successfully crushed her sister and secured her place among the elite. They were celebrating a victory that did not exist. They were adjusting their crowns blind to the fact that the kingdom had already fallen. Maya closed her laptop and stood up, stretching her back. She looked at me, her dark eyes reflecting the morning light. "We have a meeting at 3:00 p.m., she stated. I washed my coffee mug and set it in the sink. I smoothed the lapels of my blazer. Beatrice and Julianne thought they were summoning a defeated woman to sign a surrender treaty. They had no idea they had just invited the executioner into the room. Let them gloat. The slaughterhouse doors were wide open, and they were walking right in. The digital clock on the dashboard read 1:15 p.m., less than 2 hours before the meeting at Sterling Prep. I sat in the driver's seat of my sedan parked 3 blocks away from the downtown office suite I rented for my nonprofit. Maya was beside me, her eyes fixed on her iPad screen. We were waiting for the final piece of Elias Thorne's wire transfer documentation to clear. The tension in the car was thick, a silent coil winding tighter with every passing minute. Suddenly, Maya's iPad chimed. It wasn't a financial notification. It was an alert from the security system I had installed at my office. A high-definition motion sensor had tripped in the main reception area. Maya tapped the notification. The screen split into a live 4K video feed. The camera angle provided a clear, wide shot of the modest office space. The heavy glass door, which I had locked securely that morning, was cracked open. "Someone is in your office," Maya said, her voice dropping into that terrifying clinical register. I leaned over the center console, my eyes locked on the screen. A figure stepped into the frame, moving quickly toward my private desk. She wore a tailored beige trench coat, oversized sunglasses, and carried a large quilted designer tote. She didn't look like a burglar. She looked like a woman late for a brunch reservation. It was Julianne. My own sister had bypassed the building security and broken into my office. "She isn't waiting for the 3:00 p.m. meeting," I whispered, watching her frantically yank open the drawers of my filing cabinet. "She is trying to steal the original grant documentation right now." It made sickening sense. Julianne was terrified that I might back out, that I might find a legal loophole to avoid signing the federal grant over to Beatrice. She was not a strategist. She was a desperate woman drowning in her husband's margin calls. If she walked into Beatrice's office at 3:00 p.m., holding the physical original grant files, she would cement her status as the savior. She would secure her PTA seat and her social climbing victory, eliminating my leverage entirely. On the screen, Julianne abandoned the filing cabinet and moved to the small steel safe bolted under my desk. The safe held the certified copies of the $5 million federal disbursement agreement. "She doesn't have the combination," I said, watching her yank on the heavy handle. "She can't get in." Maya didn't answer. She watched the screen with predatory stillness. Julianne pulled a small silver crowbar from her designer tote bag. It was absurd, a wealthy suburban housewife wielding a pry bar, but the desperation fueling her movements was undeniable. She wedged the metal edge into the seam of the safe door and threw her entire body weight against it. The cheap locking mechanism designed to deter petty theft, not a determined insider, groaned and gave way. The heavy steel door popped open. Julianne dropped the crowbar. She reached into the safe and pulled out the thick blue manila folder containing the federal grant documents. I could see the official government seal on the cover through the high-definition feed. She shoved the folder into her tote bag, her chest heaving, a frantic, triumphant smile crossing her face. "She just committed felony burglary," Maya stated flatly. "The footage is crystal clear. I am saving this to an encrypted cloud drive right now." I felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with a profound, hollow disgust. My sister had just crossed a line from which there was no return. The betrayal was complete. But Julianne wasn't finished. Before turning to leave, she reached into the pocket of her trench coat. She pulled out a small rectangular object on a blue lanyard. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, looking around the empty office. Then, with deliberate, calculated malice, she tossed the object onto the floor right next to the broken safe. She turned on her heel and practically jogged out of the office, pushing through the glass door. "What did she just drop?" I asked, squinting at the screen. Maya zoomed in on the abandoned object. The 4K resolution rendered the details with chilling clarity. It was an ID badge. The plastic card displayed a photo, a name, and a corporate logo. It was Liam's employee badge. My brother, Maya's husband. The air in the car turned to ice. Maya's hands froze over the keyboard. The silence was absolute, heavier than any scream. Julianne hadn't just broken into my office to steal my life's work. She had intentionally planted our younger brother's identification at the scene of a federal crime. She was framing him. She was offering Liam up to the police as the scapegoat to cover her own tracks, perfectly willing to destroy his career and his freedom to protect her country club facade. I looked at Maya. Her face was a mask of cold, unadulterated fury. The veins in her neck pulsed. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but the intensity behind it was terrifying. She crossed the line, Maya said. She just tried to send my husband to prison. You do not need to hold back Savannah. There is no blood tie left to protect. Burn her to the ground. I didn't hesitate. I pulled out my phone and opened the remote security application linked to my office building. Julianne was currently in the hallway heading toward the emergency stairwell to avoid the main lobby cameras. She thought she had executed a flawless heist. She thought she was walking away with the prize. I tapped the master override command. A sharp digital chime sounded through the app. In the building 3 blocks away, the heavy magnetic locks on the emergency stairwell doors engaged with a loud metallic clack. The main glass door to my office suite locked itself. The perimeter security protocols activated instantly. I tapped a second icon on the screen. The piercing high-decibel shriek of the commercial alarm system erupted, the sound bleeding through the live video feed. It was deafening, a relentless siren designed to alert the entire block. On the iPad screen, a secondary camera in the hallway captured Julianne's reaction. She froze. The smug, triumphant smile vanished, replaced by sheer, unadulterated panic. She dropped her designer tote bag and lunged for the stairwell door, yanking frantically on the handle. It didn't budge. The magnetic lock held fast. She spun around and ran back toward my office suite, pressing her face against the glass door, realizing she was trapped in the corridor. The siren wailed. Red strobe lights flashed from the ceiling fixtures, bathing her panicked face in a harsh, intermittent glare. She was caught like a rat in a cage. I watched her pound her fists against the reinforced glass, her tailored trench coat slipping off her shoulders. She was screaming, but the sound was drowned out by the alarm. The local police precinct automatically received the signal. Units were already being dispatched. She would be found trapped in the hallway holding a stolen federal document with high-definition footage proving she broke the safe and planted false evidence. "She is done," I said, locking my phone and dropping it into my lap. "She will be in handcuffs before 2:00 p.m. Maya nodded, her expression grim and satisfied. One down. I leaned back against the headrest, trying to slow my racing heart. Julianne's capture was a victory, but it did not resolve the immediate threat. Beatrice Sterling did not know her accomplice was currently sobbing in a locked hallway. Beatrice was still sitting in her opulent office waiting for 3:00 p.m. And most importantly, Beatrice still held the forged bank lien against my mother's house. The tow truck was still idling on the curb. The threat of eviction was still active. Julianne's failure did not nullify Beatrice's leverage. The head of the snake was still intact. I checked the dashboard clock. 1:45 p.m. "We have 75 minutes," I said, turning the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. "We are not calling the police to report Julianne. Let the automated system handle her. We have an appointment at Sterling Prep." Maya closed her iPad and slid it back into her briefcase. She checked the polished edge of her blazer, restoring her armor. "I am driving," she stated. "You need to focus. You are walking into a room with a woman who believes she holds the power of life and death over your family. You cannot show an ounce of fear. You cannot show an ounce of mercy." I shifted into the passenger seat. Maya took the wheel, her movements sharp and deliberate. As we pulled away from the curb, I looked down at the printed confirmation of the Vanguard EdTech LLC debt acquisition. The paper felt heavy in my hands. Beatrice thought she was summoning a victim to sign a surrender treaty. She thought her wealth, her status, and her cruelty made her untouchable. She was about to learn that true power does not reside in a country club membership or a forged document. True power resides in the quiet, undeniable authority of holding the deed to the ground your enemy stands on. The drive to the academy was silent. The final confrontation was set. The trap was primed. It was time to close the jaws. The grandfather clock in the Sterling Preparatory Academy's main corridor chimed 3 times. The heavy mahogany double doors of the VIP conference room stood closed at the end of the hall. I stood outside them, the thick manila envelope feeling heavy in my hand. Maya waited in the car parked right by the front entrance, the engine idling. This was the final act. I took a slow, deep breath, smoothing the lapels of my worn blazer, and pushed the doors open. The conference room was designed to intimidate. Dark wood paneling, oil paintings of stern-faced founders, and a massive polished mahogany table that dominated the space. Beatrice Sterling sat at the head of the table, bathed in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She wore a sharp cream-colored suit, her legs crossed elegantly. She was tapping her manicured crimson fingernails against the polished wood in a steady, impatient rhythm. To her right sat Julianne. My sister looked significantly less put together than she had on the security footage 2 hours ago. Her hair was disheveled, the tailored trench coat wrinkled and bearing a faint smudge of dust from her desperate attempt to pry open my safe. Her husband's high-priced attorney had managed to secure her release on bail just 30 minutes prior, utilizing every ounce of his political capital to pull her out of holding before the local press caught wind. Despite her haggard appearance, Julianne's posture remained arrogant. She sat with her arms crossed, glaring at me with a look of pure, toxic triumph. She genuinely believed her husband's money had erased her crime. She believed I was walking into this room broken and ready to surrender. I walked the length of the table. My heels clicked against the hardwood floor, a steady, deliberate sound. I did not bring a lawyer. I did not bring Maya. I walked in entirely alone. Beatrice stopped tapping her nails. She offered a slow, predatory smile, leaning back in her heavy leather chair. "Savannah," she purred, her voice dripping with condescension, "you are right on time. Punctuality is such a rare trait in people of your background. I am glad you finally decided to be reasonable." I did not respond to the insult. I stopped a few feet from the head of the table. I lifted the thick, sealed manila envelope I was carrying and dropped it onto the mahogany surface. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud right in front of Beatrice. Julianne scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Look at her!" Julianne sneered, her voice raspy. "She actually thought she could fight us. You are pathetic, Savannah. You think playing the martyr makes you special. You are just a loser who has to clean up after real people. Now sign the paperwork and get out of here before I convince Beatrice to let the bank take Mom's house anyway." Beatrice raised a hand, silencing Julianne with the effortless authority of a master silencing a hound. "Now, now, Julianne," Beatrice chided gently, her eyes never leaving my face. "Let us show a little grace in victory. Savannah has brought us the federal grant authorization as requested. She understands the stakes." Beatrice leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table. The polite veneer dissolved entirely, replaced by absolute, unadulterated malice. She looked at me with an expression of pure disgust, the exact same expression she had worn in the City Hall chamber. "You see, Savannah," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "no matter how much you struggle, no matter how many grants you secure, or how many politicians you beg, garbage always returns to its proper place. You are not built for success. You never were. You are built to serve people like me. Now open the envelope and sign the transfer. The tow truck is still idling outside your mother's house. I am running out of patience." The air in the room felt compressed thick with the arrogance of 2 women who believed their wealth made them untouchable. They expected me to cry. They expected me to beg. They expected a frantic, desperate negotiation to save my mother's home. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and slowly pulled out a heavy gold fountain pen. I held it between my fingers, letting the metal catch the sunlight. I looked at Beatrice, then at Julianne. "You are right," I said. My voice was low, resonant, and entirely devoid of emotion. It sounded like ice cracking over a frozen lake. Garbage does need to be cleaned up. I uncapped the pen. The soft click echoed in the quiet room. Beatrice's smile widened, a triumphant gleam in her eyes. "Good girl," she whispered. I did not reach for the manila envelope. Instead, I placed the gold pen carefully on the polished table, pushing it slightly toward Beatrice. I reached forward and grabbed the edge of the manila envelope. I did not open the seal. With a swift, forceful motion, I ripped the entire top of the envelope off, tearing the thick paper in half. I grabbed the bottom of the envelope and threw the contents violently across the mahogany table. A thick stack of documents erupted from the torn paper, sliding across the polished wood and fanning out directly in front of Beatrice and Julianne. But it was not the $5 million federal grant authorization. It was not a surrender treaty. Beatrice looked down at the papers. The triumphant smile froze on her face. The color drained from her cheeks with shocking speed, leaving her skin a sallow, sickly gray. Sitting on top of the pile, stamped with the unmistakable, terrifying seal of the federal government, was an emergency audit order from the Internal Revenue Service. Below it, clearly visible in bold black type, were the summarized findings: suspected fraudulent conveyance money laundering and willful tax evasion regarding the operational accounts of the Sterling Preparatory Foundation. Attached to the IRS order were copies of the very spreadsheets Maya had pulled from her briefcase hours ago, detailing every phantom vendor invoice, every offshore transfer, and every illicit transaction connecting Beatrice Sterling to Julianne's husband's failing real estate developments. "What is this?" Beatrice gasped. Her voice was thin, reedy, the sophisticated timbre completely shattered. She reached out with a trembling hand, her crimson nails hovering over the IRS seal, as if the paper itself were radioactive. Julianne leaned over her brow, furrowing in confusion, as she tried to read the complex financial terminology. "What did you bring here, Savannah?" Julianne demanded, the panic starting to bleed into her voice. "Where is the grant paperwork?" I stood tall, resting my hands flat on the edge of the mahogany table. The power dynamic in the room inverted with the force of a physical blow. I was no longer the victim fighting for survival. I was the executioner reading the verdict. "That, Beatrice," I stated, my voice ringing out with absolute lethal clarity, "is the end of your empire." I gestured to the scattered papers. "You thought I came here to trade my life's work for a rusted house? You thought I was desperate enough to sign over a $5 million federal grant to a woman who uses a charity to wash dirty money for failing real estate developers?" Beatrice recoiled as if she had been struck physically. She looked from the papers to me, her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic terror. You cannot have this information," she stammered, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "These records are encrypted. They are secure. Nothing is secure when you miss 3 consecutive commercial mortgage payments to Vanguard Financial," I replied. Watching the realization hit her. When a bank flags an asset as distressed, they start looking closely at the books. And when a senior auditor from Deloitte decides to review those books, every hidden transaction becomes painfully obvious. Julianne shot out of her chair, her face contorted in a mask of desperate fury. "You are lying!" she screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You fabricated this. You are just trying to scare us. My husband's business is perfectly legal." I turned my gaze to my sister. The sheer pathetic delusion in her eyes was almost tragic. "Is that why you broke into my office an hour ago, Julianne?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. "Is that why you took a crowbar to a federal safe to steal a grant document you thought could save your husband from the margin calls?" Julianne froze. The blood drained from her face, leaving her looking hollowed out. "Yes, Julianne, I know," I continued, mercilessly closing the trap. "The 4K security cameras caught everything. The police found you trapped in the hallway because I locked the doors remotely. Your husband's high-priced lawyer might have bailed you out on the burglary charge, but he cannot bail you out of a federal money laundering indictment. The IRS has the unredacted files. They know exactly how much stolen capital your husband funneled through this school." The silence in the room was absolute suffocating. The arrogant facade of the Sterling Preparatory Academy was dissolving into ash right before my eyes. Beatrice Sterling, the woman who had tormented my mother and dismissed me as garbage, was hyperventilating, her manicured hands clutching the edge of the table as she stared at the IRS order. Julianne stood frozen, the reality of her impending ruin finally breaking through her country club delusion. I had not just refused to surrender. I had detonated a financial bomb in the center of their sanctuary. But the execution was not over. The final blow, the true mechanism of their destruction, was still waiting to be delivered. I watched them drown in their panic, preparing to hand them the final anchor. Beatrice stared at the emergency audit order resting on the mahogany table. The bold IRS seal seemed to burn a hole into the polished wood. Her eyes darted frantically across the summarized findings, tracking the precise, unforgiving numbers. Every phantom invoice, every synthetic consulting fee, every offshore wire transfer, connecting her prestigious academy to the fraudulent real estate empire of Julianne's husband, was laid bare in black and white ink. Where did you get this?" Beatrice stammered. The sophisticated, patronizing tune she had used for decades was entirely gone, replaced by the reedy, breathless voice of a cornered criminal. "This is confidential. This is sealed banking data." Her hands shook violently as she reached for the document, as if she could somehow erase the numbers by touching them. The pristine, cream-colored suit suddenly looked like a borrowed costume on a very small, very terrified woman. I did not move to stop her. I wanted her to feel the weight of the paper. I wanted her to see the exact mechanism of her ruin. I stood to my full height, squaring my shoulders. The air in the room belonged to me now. "Did you really think I came here to negotiate, Beatrice?" I asked, my voice projecting across the large conference room with absolute authority. "Did you honestly believe I walked into this room to trade a $5 million federal grant for a rusted house in the suburbs?" I leaned forward, resting my knuckles on the table, closing the physical distance between us. "I did not come here to save my mother's house. I came here to inform you that as of 20 minutes ago, federal agents initiated a freeze on every operational account linked to the Sterling Preparatory Foundation. You have zero liquidity. You cannot make payroll. You cannot pay your vendors. And you certainly cannot pay your criminal defense attorneys." The impact of the words hit Beatrice like a physical strike. She stumbled backward, her chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. "No, no, you are lying." Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "You are a nobody. You run a charity ward. You do not have the power to freeze institutional assets." Julianne, still standing frozen near the window, suddenly snapped out of her shock. The realization that Beatrice's accounts were frozen meant the laundering pipeline was shut down. It meant Julianne's husband was exposed to the margin calls with no safety net. "The house," Julianne shrieked, pointing a frantic finger at me. "The lien. Beatrice, we still have the foreclosure on the mother's house. The tow truck is out there right now. We use it. We force her to withdraw the IRS complaint. We tell the bank to seize the property immediately unless she fixes this." Julianne was hyperventilating, clinging to the only piece of leverage she thought they had left. She was trying to weaponize my mother's survival against the federal government, a desperate, pathetic attempt to maintain control. "Call the bank." Beatrice ordered, her voice shrill with panic. "Call the subsidiary. Tell them to execute the eviction. We will throw that old woman onto the pavement right now. We will see how tough you are when your mother is sleeping in a gutter Savannah." Julianne ripped her designer phone from her quilted tote bag. Her hands were shaking so badly she dropped it twice before managing to unlock the screen. She navigated to her banking application, intending to authorize the final eviction order. I watched her, my expression remaining entirely neutral. I did not try to stop her. I waited for the inevitable realization. Julianne tapped the screen. A sharp, angry red notification box popped up. She tapped it again, her brow furrowing in confusion. What is happening?" Julianne muttered, tapping the screen repeatedly with increasing desperation. "What is it?" Beatrice demanded, leaning over the table. "Call them." It is declining my login," Julianne stammered, staring at the phone. "My credentials are invalid." She quickly switched applications, opening her primary credit card account. Another red notification box. She opened her secondary checking account. "Access denied. Account suspended. Every single one of my accounts is locked." Julianne whispered, the phone slipping from her fingers and clattering onto the mahogany table. "My credit cards, the checking accounts, the investment portfolios. Everything is frozen." The heavy double doors of the conference room swung open with a loud, authoritative click. Maya stepped into the room. She wore her charcoal suit like armor. Her presence was commanding, radiating the cold, clinical precision of a senior auditor who specialized in dismantling corporate fraud. She walked past me and stopped directly across the table from Julianne. Maya did not say a word immediately. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a small rectangular object on a blue lanyard. With a swift, dismissive motion, she tossed it onto the table. It slid across the polished wood, coming to rest right next to Julianne's locked phone. It was Liam's employee badge. The badge Julianne had intentionally dropped on the floor of my office an hour ago to frame our brother for burglary. Julianne stared at the badge, the last remnants of her arrogance dissolving into sheer, unadulterated terror. "You actually thought you could plant false evidence to frame my husband," Maya said. Her voice was low, devoid of shouting, but laced with a lethal fury that made the air in the room feel 10 degrees colder. "You thought you could send your own brother to federal prison to cover your sloppy, pathetic attempt at a heist." Maya leaned over the table, her dark eyes locking onto Julianne's terrified face. "You made a catastrophic miscalculation." Julianne Maya continued her words, precise and merciless. "You thought you were dealing with Savannah's charity network. You forgot who you are related to by marriage. I am a senior audit director at Deloitte. My entire career is built on tracking illicit funds and destroying the people who hide them." Julianne shrank back, pressing herself against the window, desperate to put distance between herself and Maya. "While you were busy getting bailed out of jail for breaking into a safe," Maya explained, the rhythmic cadence of her voice acting as a hammer striking nails into a coffin. "I was sitting in the office of the county sheriff. I bypassed the local patrol officers you and your husband play golf with. I went straight to the Federal Financial Crimes Division. I handed them the unredacted ledgers. I handed them the 4K security footage of you committing a felony. And I handed them the proof of the forged signature you used to steal Helen's house." Julianne covered her face with her hands, a low, guttural sob escaping her lips. The country club facade was completely gone. She was a criminal facing decades in prison, stripped of her wealth, her status, and her delusional superiority. "Your husband is currently being detained at his corporate office," Maya stated, delivering the final blow to Julianne. "The bank froze your accounts 30 minutes ago because the assets are considered proceeds of a criminal enterprise. You are penniless, Julianne. You have nothing left." The alliance between Beatrice and Julianne, forged in greed and arrogance, was officially shattered. The weapons they had tried to use against me, the foreclosure, the forged documents, the political connections, had been systematically dismantled and turned against them. I looked at Beatrice. The powerful elite headmistress was clutching the edge of the table, her breathing erratic. She was looking at Julianne with an expression. The game was about to begin. The predators were preparing to cannibalize each other, and I was going to watch them tear their own empire apart. The silence in the conference room broke, not with a whimper, but with an explosion of pure, venomous panic. Beatrice Sterling, the woman who had spent 2 decades cultivating an image of unshakable aristocratic poise, shattered. She lunged across the mahogany table. Her crimson manicured hands bypassed the scattered IRS documents and clamped directly onto the lapels of Julianne's beige trench coat. The sudden violence of the movement sent Beatrice's heavy leather chair crashing backward against the wood-paneled wall. "You stupid, arrogant parasite," Beatrice screamed, the sophisticated timbre of her voice tearing into a raw, guttural shriek. "You sloppy, incompetent fool. I built this institution over 30 years. I survived 3 market crashes and 2 federal audits. And I am going to lose it all because you could not execute a simple document theft without leaving your fingerprints on a federal camera." Beatrice shook Julianne violently, her perfectly coiffed hair falling loose around her face. "You brought the IRS to my door. You brought federal auditors into my sanctuary because you were too busy trying to frame your own brother to cover your tracks. You destroyed my life." Julianne stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the large window frame. She shoved Beatrice's hands away, her own face contorted in a mask of desperate fury. The facade of the wealthy suburban housewife vanished completely, revealing the panicked, feral animal underneath. "Do not touch me!" Julianne shrieked, swatting at Beatrice's arms. "Do not act like you are the victim here, you corrupt old fraud. You are a glorified money launderer. You promised my husband a clean pipeline for his investor capital. You promised us discretion. You promised my son a guaranteed spot in your incoming class if we funneled the margins through your fake charity fund." Julianne pointed a shaking finger at Beatrice's chest. "You took 20% off the top of every transaction, Beatrice. You drained our liquidity to pay your own failing mortgage. You are the reason my husband is bankrupt. You squeezed us dry, and now you want to blame me because you got caught running a Ponzi scheme disguised as a prep school." The 2 women who had stood shoulder to shoulder in the cloakroom just 24 hours prior, bonded by their shared contempt for my mother and me, were now tearing each other apart. The alliance, forged in greed and class superiority, dissolved into a vicious, chaotic brawl. They traded accusations, screaming over one another, desperately trying to shift the blame for federal crimes that carried decades of prison time. I took a slow, deliberate step back from the edge of the table. I crossed my arms over my chest and watched the spectacle unfold. I did not raise my voice. I did not intervene to separate them. I did not expend a single ounce of energy. Maya stood beside me, her posture relaxed, her dark eyes tracking the implosion with clinical satisfaction. "It is a fundamental rule of fraud," Maya observed, her voice low and steady. "When the capital evaporates, the loyalty evaporates with it. They are trying to establish a narrative for the federal prosecutors. The first one to cooperate gets the plea deal. They were cannibalizing each other. Beatrice threatened to hand over the unredacted logs detailing Julianne's husband's offshore accounts. Julianne threatened to testify about the specific synthetic invoices Beatrice used to hide the transfers. They were doing the work of the FBI agents right there in the conference room. It was the absolute organic manifestation of karma. They had built a house of cards on the backs of vulnerable people, and now they were suffocating under the debris of its collapse. Julianne's eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for an exit, searching for leverage, searching for any remaining lifeline. She realized the argument with Beatrice was futile. Beatrice was a sinking ship, and Julianne was tied to the mast. Julianne's gaze locked onto me. The feral anger in her eyes shifted instantly into a performative, desperate vulnerability. The transition was so rapid it was almost nauseating to witness. She realized she could not bully me. She realized she could not outsmart Maya. The only tactic she had left was the one she had exploited our entire lives: familial guilt. Julianne abandoned the argument with Beatrice. She dropped to her knees on the hardwood floor right in front of me. She scrambled forward, her hands reaching out to grab the hem of my blazer. "Savannah, please!" Julianne sobbed, her voice cracking into a high-pitched wail. The tears flowed freely now, ruining her expensive makeup and leaving dark streaks down her cheeks. "Please, Savannah, you have to help me. I am your sister. We are family." She clung to my jacket, her knuckles white. "I was manipulated, Savannah. Beatrice lied to me. She told my husband this was standard financial restructuring. We did not know she was committing tax evasion. We were just trying to survive the market dip." Julianne looked up at me, her eyes wide and pleading. "They arrested my husband, Savannah. The bank froze everything. I have nothing. I cannot even buy groceries. What about my children? What about your niece and nephew? You run a charity for children. Are you really going to stand there and watch your own family become homeless? You cannot let them take the kids. You have to tell the authorities I was coerced. You have to tell them the signature on the house lien was a misunderstanding. Please, Savannah. Blood is thicker than water." I looked down at the woman kneeling at my feet. This was the same woman who had stood on the worn sofa in our mother's house, holding a forged document and sneering at the woman who raised us. This was the same woman who had watched our mother kneel in spilled wine, holding coats for the elite, and smiled. This was the same woman who had planted an ID badge in a broken safe, intending to send our youngest brother to federal prison just to save her country club membership. I did not feel a shred of pity. I did not feel a flicker of sibling loyalty. The emotional manipulation tactics she had used for 30 years no longer held any currency. I leaned down. I did not pull away violently. I moved slowly, deliberately. I reached out and gently gripped Julianne's wrists. I detached her fingers from the fabric of my blazer one by one until her hands fell limply to her sides. I straightened up, looking directly into her tear-stained face. "Blood is merely a biological accident, Julianne," I said, my voice quiet and completely devoid of warmth. "It is a shared genetic sequence. It is not a binding contract that requires me to absorb your abuse or cover your crimes." Julianne stared at me, her mouth opening and closing, but no sound coming out. She was waiting for the forgiveness I had always offered in the past. She was waiting for the younger sister who always cleaned up the messes. That sister no longer existed. "You made your choice, Julianne." I continued the finality in my tone, echoing in the large room. "You made your choice when you forged our mother's signature to steal her only shelter. You made your choice when you stood in that cloakroom and watched her scrub wine off her shoes to protect your social status. You severed the blood tie yourself. I took a step back, creating physical distance between us. Do not invoke the names of your children to me, I warned. Your children are losing their home because you and your husband decided to steal from the vulnerable to fund a lifestyle you could not afford. You gambled their security on a Ponzi scheme, and you lost. You are an adult. You will face the consequences of your actions in a federal courtroom. I will not save you. I will not speak for you. And I will never allow you near my mother or my brother again." Julianne collapsed onto the floor, weeping uncontrollably. She buried her face in her hands, the reality of her total absolute ruin finally breaking her. She had nothing left to bargain with. She was entirely alone. I turned my attention away from the pathetic display on the floor. I looked past the weeping woman and locked eyes with Beatrice Sterling. Beatrice was still breathing heavily, leaning against the wall. She had stopped shouting, but the panic in her eyes remained. She thought the worst of the execution was over. She thought losing the bank accounts and facing an IRS audit was the bottom of the abyss. She was wrong. The financial ruin was only the preliminary strike. The true mechanism of her destruction, the absolute transfer of power, was still waiting in my pocket. I had promised to take her school. It was time to deliver on that promise. Beatrice Sterling pushed herself away from the wall. The sheer survival instinct of a cornered predator briefly overrode her panic. She straightened her spine, attempting to physically reconstruct the aristocratic authority she had wielded for 3 decades. The IRS audit was a catastrophic blow, but in her mind, she still possessed the ultimate shield. She still believed she controlled the physical ground beneath her feet. She slammed her open palms against the mahogany table, the sharp crack cutting through the sound of Julianne's quiet sobbing. "You think you can intimidate me with a preliminary audit?" Beatrice snarled, her voice trembling with forced defiance. "You think a few frozen accounts give you the right to dictate terms in my building? This is my institution. I built this academy. I secured the historical designation for this property. This land, this building, everything within these walls belongs to the Sterling Preparatory Foundation." She pointed a rigid finger toward the heavy double doors. "I will fight the IRS in court. I will hire the best defense attorneys on the Eastern Seaboard and tie these allegations up in litigation for years. But you have no legal standing here. You are trespassing on private property. Get out of my school right now before I have the local police drag you out in handcuffs." Beatrice lifted her chin, a desperate, fragile mask of superiority clinging to her face. She truly believed that regardless of the federal charges, she remained the sovereign ruler of the Sterling estate. She thought the physical walls of the academy were an impenetrable fortress against a woman she still viewed as lower-class garbage. I did not move toward the door. I did not flinch at the threat of law enforcement. I stood perfectly still, letting her empty, hollow demands echo in the large conference room. I reached slowly into the inner pocket of my blazer. I bypassed the gold fountain pen. My fingers closed around a thick, folded document printed on heavy legal stock paper. I pulled it out and held it up, allowing the afternoon sunlight to illuminate the raised crimson seal stamped across the top right corner. It was the official insignia of the Massachusetts State Registry of Deeds. I looked directly into Beatrice's eyes. The defiance I saw there was about to be extinguished permanently. "No, Beatrice," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, lethal register that carried absolute finality. "This is not your school." With a swift, deliberate motion, I threw the document. It slid across the polished mahogany surface, gliding past the scattered IRS audit papers and stopping precisely at the edge of the table directly in front of Beatrice's hands. Beatrice stared at the paper. The crimson seal seemed to glow in the light. She hesitated, her eyes darting between the document and my face. Slowly she lowered her gaze and read the bold black text at the center of the page. It was an assignment of deed of trust. The document detailed the immediate and irrevocable transfer of the $3 million commercial mortgage encumbering the Sterling Preparatory Academy campus. The assigner was listed as Vanguard Financial. The assignee, the new legal holder of the debt, and the property lien was listed as Vanguard EdTech LLC. Beatrice's breath hitched. Her eyes scanned the legal jargon, searching desperately for a loophole, a mistake, a reason why the document could not be real. "The bank sold your debt." "Beatrice," I explained, spelling out the exact nature of her execution. "You missed 3 consecutive commercial mortgage payments. You defaulted on the primary loan securing this entire campus. Vanguard Financial classified your note as a highly distressed toxic asset. They wanted it off their books before the market opened this morning. I took a slow, measured step closer to the table. They sold the debt at a steep discount to a blind shell company. They transferred the lien, the mortgage, and the total legal authority over this property to a newly registered Delaware corporation named Vanguard EdTech LLC. Beatrice looked up from the paper, her face a mask of profound, uncomprehending horror. She was struggling to connect the corporate entity to the woman standing in front of her. I leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the mahogany table. I lowered my head until I was mere inches from the woman who had poured wine on my mother's shoes. "I am the sole managing director of Vanguard EdTech LLC." I whispered the words, hitting her like physical strikes. "I authorized the wire transfer at 6 o'clock this morning, using capital secured from a private equity firm in Silicon Valley. I bought your debt, Beatrice. I own your mortgage." The color drained entirely from Beatrice's face, leaving her skin a translucent, sickly gray. The realization crashed down upon her, annihilating the last pillar of her reality. She was not the sovereign ruler of the Sterling estate. She was a tenant in default. You cannot do this," Beatrice stammered, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own rapid breathing. "You do not have that kind of capital. You run a charity." I smiled a cold, predatory smile that did not reach my eyes. "I spent 2 years navigating the bureaucracy of federal grants and venture capital networks to build schools for children you deemed unworthy," I replied. "You underestimated my resources because you spent your entire life evaluating people based on their zip code instead of their capability. You thought I was a victim. You forgot I am a CEO." I tapped a finger against the assignment of deed of trust, resting near her trembling hands. "Because you are currently in severe default on the terms of this mortgage, Vanguard EdTech LLC exercises its immediate right to initiate foreclosure proceedings," I stated, executing the final administrative protocol. "However, given the extreme nature of the IRS audit regarding your fraudulent operational accounts, we are bypassing standard mediation." I reached into my pocket one last time and withdrew a single crisp white sheet of paper. I dropped it directly on top of the deed of trust. "This is a formal 30-day notice of eviction," I announced, my voice ringing clear and authoritative through the room. "As the primary creditor, holding a defaulted note on a commercial property engaged in active federal financial crimes, I am seizing the collateral." Beatrice stared at the eviction notice. The words seemed to blur together before her eyes. The empire she had spent 30 years building, the institution she used to terrorize the vulnerable and wash dirty money, was gone, erased by a single financial transaction she never saw coming. "You are no longer the headmistress of this academy, Beatrice," I said, delivering the final crushing verdict. "You are an illegal squatter occupying a building that belongs to my foundation. You have exactly 30 days to remove your personal belongings from these premises. If you or any member of your corrupt administration are found on this property after the deadline, you will be arrested for criminal trespassing." Beatrice Sterling, the woman who had stood in the city council chamber and declared that education was not for my tax bracket, simply folded. Her legs gave way beneath her. She collapsed into the heavy leather chair, the rigid aristocratic posture dissolving entirely. She looked small, ancient, and utterly defeated. The arrogance that had defined her existence was stripped away, leaving nothing but a bankrupt felon waiting for the federal prosecutors to arrive. Julianne, still weeping on the floor near the window, looked at Beatrice and then at the eviction notice. The finality of the situation settled over her as well. There was no escape. There was no leverage. The elite circle they had both worshipped and manipulated was burning to the ground, and I had personally lit the match. I did not offer a parting insult. I did not gloat. The absolute legal and financial destruction of my enemies was a sufficient statement. I turned away from the table. Maya, who had stood silently observing the execution, nodded once, a gesture of profound professional respect. We walked together toward the heavy mahogany double doors. We did not look back at the ruined women in the conference room. We walked down the main corridor of the academy, our heels clicking against the marble floors. The sound echoed through the halls, not as the footsteps of an intruder, but as the confident, measured stride of the new owner taking possession of her estate. The battle was over. The purge was complete. Now the real work, the work of rebuilding, could begin. The 30 days following the confrontation in the conference room were a masterclass in the velocity of ruin. When the foundation of a corrupt empire cracks, the collapse is not a slow crumble. It is a catastrophic freefall. I did not need to issue press releases or orchestrate public smears. The undeniable gravity of federal indictments and foreclosed assets did the work for me. Beatrice Sterling's descent was rapid and spectacularly public. The morning after the IRS audit order was executed, federal agents raided the administrative offices of Sterling Preparatory Academy. They carried out dozens of cardboard boxes filled with financial records and cloned the hard drives of every server in the building. The sight of armed federal agents at the city's most elite private school was catnip for the local news networks. News vans clogged the circular driveway, broadcasting the raid live across Boston. By the end of the week, the Boston City Council convened an emergency session. The same council members who had laughed at me and awarded Beatrice my zoning permit now scrambled to distance themselves from a woman facing federal money laundering charges. The vote to strip Beatrice of her council seat was unanimous. The resolution cited severe ethical violations and breach of public trust. The council stripped her title, invalidated her voting record, and permanently barred her from holding public office in the municipality. The most visceral image of her downfall, however, did not come from a news broadcast or a city hall transcript. It came from a smartphone. On the 29th day of the eviction notice period, a group of Sterling Prep seniors standing in the courtyard recorded Beatrice leaving the campus for the final time. The video uploaded to social media went viral within hours. It showed Beatrice stripped of her tailored crimson suits and designer jewelry, wearing a nondescript beige trench coat. She carried a single cardboard bank box containing the meager personal effects the federal agents allowed her to keep. Her posture was stooped, her face haggard and hidden behind oversized sunglasses. As she walked toward a waiting taxi, a student off-camera yelled, "A charity ward needs tax revenue, not a criminal, Beatrice." The video ended with her hastily shoving the box into the trunk and climbing into the back seat, fleeing the grounds she once ruled like a monarch. Julianne's destruction was less public, but infinitely more brutal. Her husband, terrified of the cascading federal investigation regarding his offshore accounts, severed all ties immediately. He filed for divorce the day after Beatrice's accounts were frozen. His corporate defense attorneys executed a ruthless legal strategy, filing motions that categorized Julianne's unauthorized mortgage against my mother's house as a rogue criminal act committed without his knowledge. He effectively isolated his assets, leaving Julianne to bear the full weight of the legal consequences. The country club friends who had eagerly consumed Julianne's gossip and attended her charity luncheons vanished. Her phone calls went unanswered. Her invitations to networking events were revoked. She was socially radioactive. Without access to her husband's wealth or the fraudulent liquidity from Beatrice, Julianne could not afford the retainer for a decent defense attorney. She was forced to vacate her sprawling suburban estate, returning the keys to the bank as foreclosure proceedings began. She moved into a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a neglected neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. The final blow landed on a Tuesday afternoon. A process server knocked on the door of her new apartment and handed her a thick manila envelope. It contained a subpoena from the county district attorney. They were officially pursuing felony charges for wire fraud and forgery regarding the unauthorized home equity line of credit taken against Helen's property. Julianne was facing a mandatory minimum sentence if convicted. The golden child who had built her entire identity on perceived superiority was now a destitute suspect waiting for a trial date. While Beatrice and Julianne drowned in the consequences of their own arrogance, Maya and I initiated a complete operational overhaul of the newly acquired campus. We did not simply redecorate. We purged the building of its elitist history and fundamentally rebuilt its purpose. The 30 days were a blur of structural engineers, commercial contractors, and specialized educational consultants. We utilized the remaining capital from the Venture Bridge loan and the newly unlocked $5 million federal grant to transform the antiquated facility. The dark wood paneling and oil paintings of the founders were stripped away, donated to a local historical society. We knocked down walls, expanding the cramped classrooms into open collaborative learning spaces bathed in natural light. We brought in sensory integration specialists to design environments tailored specifically for autistic children. We installed advanced acoustic dampening materials in the ceilings and walls to minimize auditory overload. We replaced the harsh fluorescent lighting with adjustable full-spectrum LED systems. The library, once a dusty archive of obsolete textbooks, was converted into a state-of-the-art technology center equipped with AI-driven learning software designed to adapt to individual neurodivergent learning profiles. The golf practice green, the very parcel of land Beatrice had used to mock me, was torn up entirely. In its place, contractors poured a specialized rubberized surface and erected a massive, inclusive playground featuring adaptive equipment designed for children with mobility and sensory challenges. Throughout the grueling renovation, Maya handled the complex financial restructuring. She finalized the refinancing protocols, shifting the commercial debt away from Elias Thorne's private equity firm and securing a long-term, low-interest mortgage under the auspices of our nonprofit foundation. She ensured every dollar of the federal grant was allocated with meticulous transparency, preparing proactive audit reports to preempt any future regulatory scrutiny. By the end of the month, the transformation was complete. The Sterling Preparatory Academy, a bastion of exclusionary privilege, was dead. In its place stood the Vanguard Center for Neurodiverse Excellence, a fully funded tuition-free academy dedicated to providing world-class education and therapeutic support to children the system had traditionally discarded. On the 30th day, as the final coat of paint dried in the main corridor, I drove to my mother's house. The rusted chain-link fence was gone, replaced by a neat white picket barrier. The heavy-duty commercial tow truck was a distant memory. I had used a portion of the operational budget to pay off the fraudulent home equity line of credit in full, executing a quiet title action to ensure Helen's ownership was absolute and unencumbered. The house was safe. It belonged to her. I helped Helen into the passenger seat of my car. We drove across the city, navigating the familiar route toward the historic district. I did not tell her where we were going. When we pulled up to the curb outside the newly renovated campus, I parked the car and walked around to help her out. Helen leaned heavily on her cane, her joints aching from the damp morning air. She looked up at the massive brick building, her eyes scanning the fresh landscaping and the wide, welcoming entrance. Then she looked higher. Suspended above the heavy mahogany doors, where the bronze crest of Sterling Prep had hung for decades, was a massive new sign. The sleek modern lettering read, "The Vanguard Center for Neurodiverse Excellence." Below it, in smaller, elegant script, it read, "Dedicated to the belief that every child is built for success." Helen stood on the sidewalk, the morning sun illuminating her weathered face. She looked at the building and then turned to look at me. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over her lashes and tracking down her cheeks. They were not tears of pain or humiliation. They were tears of profound, overwhelming pride. "You did this, Savannah." Helen whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You really did this." I wrapped my arms around her frail shoulders, holding her close. "We did this, Mom," I replied, looking up at the banner. We took it back. The contrast was absolute. The women who had sought to destroy us were currently facing prison sentences and bankruptcy, isolated by their own greed. Meanwhile, the woman they had mocked and the daughter they had underestimated were standing before a monument to resilience and equity. We had not just survived the assault. We had consumed the enemy's fortress and transformed it into a sanctuary. The victory was total, but the real work, the work that actually mattered, was scheduled to begin the very next morning. The Vanguard Center for Neurodiverse Excellence was scheduled to open its doors at 8 o'clock the following morning. The local media had latched onto the story with ferocious intensity. The narrative was irresistible. A local nonprofit director secures a massive federal grant, executes a flawless hostile takeover of a disgraced elite academy, and transforms the campus into a tuition-free sanctuary for autistic children. My face was on the homepage of every major Boston news outlet. Reporters were camped out in the newly paved parking lot, testing camera angles and setting up broadcast tents. The momentum was entirely in our favor. I sat in my new office, the very room where Beatrice had once conducted her illicit transactions. The space had been stripped of its opulent, intimidating decor, replaced with functional modern furniture and walls painted a calming, muted blue. Maya sat across from me, reviewing the final caterer invoices for the morning reception. The atmosphere was focused the quiet hum of a major operation finalizing its last details. The piece lasted until 8:15 p.m. My phone resting face up on the desk buzzed violently. A text message notification appeared on the screen. The sender was Julianne. I had not spoken to my sister since the confrontation in the conference room 30 days ago. I had ignored the frantic voicemails she left during the first week of her eviction. I assumed her impending felony trial for forgery would command her full attention. I was wrong. The desperation for money and attention apparently overrode basic self-preservation. I tapped the screen and opened the message. Savannah, the text read, "I see you are the darling of the Boston press now. Must be nice playing the hero. I am currently living in a roach-infested apartment because of you. My kids are sleeping on air mattresses. The press would love to know how the great Savannah Pierce left her own niece and nephew homeless to fund her little vanity project. Send $50,000 to my routing number by midnight, or I am bringing the kids to your ribbon cutting tomorrow. I will scream to every camera there how you abandoned your family. Do not test me." I stared at the glowing screen. The sheer pathological narcissism was staggering. Julianne had forged our mother's signature to steal a house, attempted to frame our brother for burglary, and was now attempting extortion using her own children as props. She believed the threat of bad PR would force me into compliance. She thought I was vulnerable because the spotlight was on me. Maya looked up from her invoices, noticing the shift in my posture. "What is it?" she asked, setting her pen down. I slid the phone across the desk. Maya read the message, her expression remaining entirely neutral. She tapped the screen, scrolling down slightly, then pushed the phone back toward me. "Extortion is a fascinating tactic for a woman currently out on bail for wire fraud," Maya observed, her voice dry and analytical. "If she causes a disturbance at a public event and issues a financial demand in front of witnesses, the district attorney will revoke her bail and add blackmail to the indictment. She is handing them the rope to hang her." "She is desperate," I said, shaking my head. "And she thinks I care about the optics more than the reality." Before I could type a response, my office landline rang. It was the internal security extension at the front desk. I picked up the receiver. "Ms. Pierce," the overnight security guard said, his voice hesitant. "I apologize for disturbing you, but a reporter from the Boston Tribune just approached the perimeter fence. He is asking for credential verification for tomorrow morning. He says he has an exclusive feature arranged with a VIP guest." "What VIP guest?" I asked, my brow furrowing. Maya and I had strictly controlled the press list. We had not authorized any exclusive features. The guard paused, shuffling papers. He said the feature is centered around your former mentor, a Beatrice Sterling. He claims she is arriving tomorrow to publicly support the initiative and reveal her role as your silent advisor. I gripped the receiver tightly. The pieces clicked together instantly. Beatrice was not just a disgraced criminal awaiting trial. She was a master manipulator who understood the mechanics of public relations. She knew her reputation was incinerated. She knew she was facing prison. But she also knew that if she could hijack my press coverage, if she could stand in front of the cameras and spin a narrative of reconciliation and mentorship, she could muddy the waters. She could paint herself as a misunderstood visionary who had secretly guided my success, hoping the positive association would influence the federal judge during her sentencing hearing. She had likely paid a corrupt lower-tier reporter to facilitate the ambush, aiming to force a public embrace that I could not reject without looking vindictive on live television. "Deny the reporter's credentials," I instructed the guard, my voice tight. "Do not let him on the property." I hung up the phone and looked at Maya. "Beatrice is planning an ambush tomorrow morning. She paid a reporter to set up a reconciliation narrative. She wants to stand in front of the cameras and claim credit for the academy. She wants to steal the narrative to save her sentencing report." Maya leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. "Julianne wants to extort you with a public tantrum, and Beatrice wants to hijack your press conference for a PR stunt. They are both operating under the assumption that you will prioritize avoiding a scene over executing justice." Maya smiled, that same cold, razor-sharp smile I had seen in the diner 30 days ago. "They think you are afraid of the cameras, Savannah. They think the spotlight makes you weak." I looked down at Julianne's extortion text still glowing on my phone screen. Then I looked at the security monitors on my wall displaying the empty, pristine corridors of the new academy. The building was ready. The mission was pure. I had spent 2 years fighting in the shadows, fighting corrupt politicians and greedy family members behind closed doors. I had nothing to hide. My conscience was entirely clean. If Beatrice and Julianne wanted to use the media against me, they were severely underestimating my willingness to engage. I was not going to negotiate with terrorists. I was not going to pay hush money to a sister who stole from our mother. And I was absolutely not going to allow Beatrice Sterling to launder her reputation using my life's work as detergent. They wanted a public spectacle. I would give them a public execution. I picked up my phone. I did not block Julianne's number. I did not draft a lengthy defensive reply explaining why I would not pay her. I did not contact the police to report the extortion threat. I typed a single sentence and sent it directly to Julianne. Then I opened a new message, entered Beatrice's personal email address, the same one she had used to demand my surrender 30 days ago, and pasted the exact same sentence. The main gates open at 8:00 a.m. Be there. I hit send. I set the phone down on the desk. The trap was set. It was not a trap of locked doors or hidden cameras. It was a trap built entirely of truth and public exposure. They believed they could manipulate the narrative because they had spent their entire lives manipulating the truth behind closed doors. They did not understand that when you operate with absolute transparency, the cameras are not a threat. They are a weapon. I looked at Maya. Ensure the press area is positioned directly in front of the main podium tomorrow. I instructed, my voice calm and decisive. I want a clear, unobstructed sightline for every camera crew on the lot. And inform security that when Beatrice Sterling and Julianne Hayes arrive at the main gate, they are not to be turned away. Escort them directly to the VIP section in the front row. Maya's eyes gleamed with approval. She understood the strategy perfectly. You are inviting them onto the stage. I am inviting them to the slaughter, I corrected, standing up from the desk. They want to use the media to save themselves. I am going to let the media broadcast their destruction live to every household in Boston. Let them come. Let them stand in the front row. Tomorrow morning we do not just cut a ribbon. We cut the cancer out completely. The morning air was crisp and clear, carrying the distinct energy of a major public event. By 7:30 a.m., the newly paved circular driveway of the Vanguard Center for Neurodiverse Excellence was packed. A sea of folding chairs arranged on the manicured lawn faced the grand entrance, where a massive red ribbon stretched across the mahogany double doors. The media presence was overwhelming. 5 local news vans hummed near the perimeter fence. Camera crews jockeyed for position on the elevated press risers, situated directly in front of the main podium. Photographers milled around the front rows, capturing candid shots of the arriving guests. The mayor of Boston was present, chatting amiably with the venture capitalists from Silicon Valley who had provided the bridge loan. Hundreds of parents, many holding the hands of autistic children who would soon walk these halls, filled the middle sections. The atmosphere was a potent mix of corporate triumph and genuine tearful gratitude. I stood just inside the main doors, watching the crowd assemble through the glass panes. I wore a tailored stark white suit, a deliberate visual departure from the worn blazers I used to wear when begging for funding. I felt a steady electric current of adrenaline humming beneath my skin. I was not nervous. I was perfectly, ruthlessly prepared. At 7:45 a.m., Helen arrived, escorted by Maya and Liam. My mother looked radiant, wearing a soft blue dress, her hair carefully styled. Liam, my youngest brother, guided her gently by the elbow. He wore a sharp navy suit, looking proud and completely unburdened by the burglary charges Julianne had tried to pin on him. Maya directed them to the VIP section in the absolute front row, ensuring they had the best view of the podium. At 7:55 a.m., the ambush arrived. I watched through the glass as Beatrice Sterling stepped out of a black town car. She had abandoned the beige trench coat of her eviction. She was dressed for war, wearing a meticulously tailored dark sapphire pantsuit. Her hair perfectly coiffed, her makeup flawless. She projected an aura of unshakable authority, a desperate, calculated illusion designed to trick the cameras into believing she still belonged in the elite circle. She did not skulk in the back. She marched directly toward the press area, flashing a practiced, magnanimous smile at a reporter she had likely paid off the night before. Guided by my explicit instructions to security, she was not stopped. A guard politely directed her to the VIP seating area. Beatrice glided to the front row, taking a seat just 3 chairs down from my mother. Helen stiffened her hands, gripping her purse, but Liam placed a reassuring hand on her arm, shooting Beatrice a look of absolute chilling indifference. Minutes later, a silver sedan pulled up near the side entrance. Julianne emerged, dragging her 2 young children by the hands. She had dressed them in stiff, uncomfortable Sunday clothes. Julianne herself wore a modest floral dress, attempting to project the image of a struggling, devoted mother rather than a desperate extortionist. She scanned the crowd, her eyes wide with a frantic, chaotic energy. She spotted the media risers and immediately began maneuvering her children toward the edge of the stage, positioning herself perfectly in the wing. She was waiting for the cameras to roll, ready to launch her extortion plot, ready to weaponize her own children's confusion to disrupt my moment of triumph. The pieces were on the board. The predators had walked willingly into the snare, blinded by their own narcissism, convinced that their manipulative tactics would override my resolve in front of a live audience. They believed I would shrink under the spotlight. They believed I would prioritize public decorum over justice. The digital clock on my phone hit 8:00 a.m. The event coordinator, a brisk woman with a headset, signaled me from the doorway. "You are up, Ms. Pierce. The live feeds are rolling." I took a final deep breath. I pushed the mahogany doors open and stepped out onto the wide stone landing. The applause started instantly, a rolling wave of sound that washed over the lawn. The camera shutters erupted into a frantic symphony of clicks. The bright lights from the press risers illuminated the stage, casting everything into sharp, undeniable clarity. I walked to the podium. I did not rush. My stride was measured, confident, and entirely commanding. I reached the microphone, placing my hands lightly on the edges of the wooden stand. I looked out over the crowd. I saw the mayor nodding approvingly. I saw Helen wiping a tear from her cheek. I saw Julianne hovering in the wing, her grip tightening on her son's arm, her eyes fixed on me with a toxic, demanding glare. And I saw Beatrice Sterling sitting in the front row, her posture rigid, her face arranged in an expression of benevolent pride. She caught my eye and offered a small, encouraging nod, playing the role of the silent mentor to absolute perfection for the cameras she knew were capturing the exchange. She was ready to stand up. She was ready to steal the narrative. I leaned into the microphone. "Good morning, Boston." I began, my voice projecting strong and clear across the lawn, echoing through the high-definition speakers and into the live broadcast feeds. We are standing today on grounds that have undergone a profound transformation. We are standing before the Vanguard Center for Neurodiverse Excellence. The crowd erupted into fresh applause. I waited for it to die down completely. I needed absolute silence for the execution. For decades, the building behind me represented exclusivity. I continued, my tone shifting from celebratory to deeply serious. It was a fortress built to separate the privileged from the marginalized. It was an institution that hoarded resources, while children in this very city were denied basic educational rights simply because their minds functioned differently. I paused, letting the weight of the words settle over the audience. The camera zoomed in, capturing every nuance of my expression. When I set out to build this academy, I faced significant opposition. I stated maintaining direct eye contact with the press risers. I was told that this prime real estate was too valuable for a charity ward. I was told that funding specialized education for autistic children was a waste of resources. A murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not a standard sanitized ribbon-cutting speech. I was airing the dirty laundry, and the media was hanging on every word. I shifted my gaze from the cameras. I looked directly at the front row. I locked eyes with Beatrice Sterling. Her benevolent smile faltered slightly. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her features. She shifted in her seat, sensing the sudden change in the atmospheric pressure. She expected me to pivot to a message of reconciliation, to offer the olive branch she had paid a reporter to document. Instead, I tightened my grip on the podium. The time for polite metaphors was over. The time for the public execution had arrived. I held Beatrice Sterling's gaze. The silence in the courtyard was absolute. Even the camera shutters seemed to pause in anticipation. The morning air felt sharp, primed for the detonation. I offered a slow, deliberate smile, turning my head to face the bank of television cameras directly in front of the podium. Today, I would like to extend a very specific acknowledgement. I announced, my voice ringing out with a cold, terrifying clarity. I want to personally thank the individual who provided the foundational lesson that led to this moment. A woman who evaluated my potential 20 years ago and declared her verdict. I gestured gracefully toward the VIP seating area in the front row. Please direct your attention to the former headmistress of Sterling Preparatory Academy, Beatrice Sterling. The television cameras swiveled immediately. Lenses zoomed, capturing Beatrice sitting in her sapphire suit. Beatrice reacted exactly as I knew she would. Blinded by her own narcissism and her desperate need to control the narrative, she misread the moment entirely. She believed I was capitulating to the pressure of the media presence. She believed her paid reporter had successfully forced my hand. She lifted her chin, the aristocratic mask snapping firmly back into place. She offered a gracious, practiced smile and actually rose slightly from her chair, preparing to step forward and embrace the false narrative of mentorship she had orchestrated. I did not let her stand. I did not give her a single second to bask in the illusion. I leaned closer to the microphone. The smile vanished from my face, replaced by a hardened, impenetrable resolve. 20 years ago, Beatrice Sterling stood in front of my mother and informed her that children from my background were simply not built for success. I stated, my voice echoing like a physical strike across the manicured lawn. Just a few weeks ago, in the City Hall chambers, she reiterated that belief, stating that education was simply not for my tax bracket. She attempted to use her political influence to strip the zoning permits from this very foundation, because she believed children with autism were not worthy of occupying historic real estate. A collective gasp ripped through the audience. The mayor of Boston stiffened his political instincts, screaming that the situation was escalating rapidly beyond a standard PR event. The reporters on the risers scrambled frantically, adjusting their audio feeds, realizing they were capturing a live, unscripted implosion. Beatrice froze halfway out of her chair. The gracious smile shattered. The blood drained from her face, leaving a sickly pale hue. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a sudden suffocating panic. She opened her mouth, perhaps to shout a denial, perhaps to demand the cameras be turned off, but she was paralyzed by the sheer, undeniable exposure. I was not finished, and today Beatrice is here with us. I continued, letting the sentence hang in the air for a fraction of a second. I reached down and pressed a small, nondescript black button mounted on the side of the wooden podium. Behind me, the massive state-of-the-art digital display board that arched over the main entrance of the academy, intended to cycle through images of smiling students and architectural renderings, flared to brilliant life. The screen did not display a logo. It did not display a message of thanks. It displayed a crystal-clear, high-definition projection of a federal legal document. The bold black text was legible to the very back row of the audience. The seal of the Internal Revenue Service was unmistakable. Below it, the summarized findings glared in the morning sun. Suspected fraudulent conveyance, money laundering, and willful tax evasion regarding the operational accounts of the Sterling Preparatory Foundation. Right beside it, sharing the massive screen, was the 30-day notice of eviction, clearly naming Beatrice Sterling as a defaulting tenant occupying a commercial property seized by Vanguard EdTech LLC. She is here to witness me taking the very building she used as a front to launder illicit real estate funds and transforming it into a fully funded, tuition-free sanctuary for the exact children she tried to throw away. I concluded, my voice rising over the rising clamor of the crowd. The courtyard erupted into absolute chaos. The reporters on the press risers went into a frenzy. Cameramen physically shoved past one another, abandoning the podium to train their lenses directly on Beatrice Sterling. Microphones were thrust forward. The live broadcast feeds captured the exact moment the most prestigious educator in Boston was exposed as a bankrupt felon on a 50-foot LED screen. Beatrice collapsed back into her chair. Her hands flew to her face, a pathetic, reflexive attempt to hide from the blinding flashes of the cameras. She was hyperventilating, her shoulders shaking violently. The carefully constructed armor of her wealth and status had been vaporized in less than 60 seconds. She was completely exposed, pinned to her chair by the crushing weight of public ruin. She had tried to use the media to launder her reputation. I had just used the media to execute her. I did not offer her a single glance of pity. I had stated the facts, presented the evidence, and let the consequences run their course. The execution was flawless, but I still had one more target remaining on the board. The ambush was not over. The second predator was still waiting in the wings, and she was about to learn that leveraging family ties against me was the most catastrophic mistake she could possibly make. I did not step away from the podium. The chaos swirling around Beatrice Sterling in the front row was deafening, but my focus had already shifted. The execution required one final stroke. I turned my head away from the press risers and looked directly at the side wing of the stage. Julianne stood there paralyzed. She gripped the hands of her two young children so tightly their knuckles were white. She had arrived expecting a capitulation. She had planned to use the threat of a public tantrum to extort $50,000, believing the cameras were a shield. Instead, she had just watched those same cameras incinerate her co-conspirator. The smug extortionist was gone, replaced by a woman staring into the headlights of oncoming traffic. I leaned back into the microphone. The sheer authority in my voice cut through the ambient noise, forcing the reporters to split their attention between the ruined headmistress and the woman cowering in the wing. And finally I stated, my gaze locked onto my sister. I have the message for the woman currently standing by the side entrance, preparing to use her own children as props in a desperate extortion attempt. The cameras pivoted instantly. Dozens of lenses swung away from Beatrice and zeroed in on Julianne. The bright lights illuminated her floral dress and her terrified, wide-eyed expression. She shrank back instinctively, trying to pull her children behind her, but there was nowhere to hide. Julianne Hayes. I announced, clearly ensuring the name was recorded on every live feed in Boston. The 4K security footage capturing your attempt to pry open a federal safe in my office and intentionally plant false evidence to frame your own brother for burglary has been fully processed by the district attorney. Julianne gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She shook her head frantically, a pathetic, useless denial against a wall of hard evidence. "Your husband is bankrupt," I continued the rhythmic cadence of my delivery, leaving her no room to breathe. "Your accounts are frozen under federal investigation, and your attempt to extort $50,000 from this foundation via text message last night has just been added to your active indictment." The courtyard erupted again. The sheer density of the scandal, the absolute exposure of high society corruption, was a media goldmine. The social rejection was immediate and physical. The wealthy donors and politicians sitting in the VIP section, nearest to Beatrice and Julianne, literally stood up and stepped backward. They recoiled, as if proximity to the two women might contaminate them. In seconds, a wide, empty perimeter formed around Beatrice slumping in her chair, and Julianne trembling near the wing. It was a visual quarantine, a brutal, undeniable manifestation of absolute social exile. The whispered shock of the crowd rapidly morphed into audible outrage. Parents who had paid exorbitant tuition to Sterling Prep, realizing their money, had funded a laundering operation, shouted angry questions toward the front row. The press corps, abandoning any semblance of restraint, swarmed the empty perimeter. Reporters shoved microphones into Beatrice's face, demanding statements regarding the offshore accounts and the eviction notice glowing on the screen behind her. Flashbulbs strobed relentlessly, capturing her tear-streaked, ruined face from every possible angle. Julianne did not fare any better. She tried to turn and run, dragging her children toward the parking lot, but her path was blocked. Two uniformed officers from the Boston Police Department, who had been stationed near the perimeter fence for crowd control, pushed through the throng of reporters. They approached Julianne, their expressions stern and professional. "Ma'am, you need to come with us," one of the officers stated loudly enough to be heard over the commotion. "You are currently in violation of a standing court order regarding your pending fraud case." Julianne broke down completely. She sobbed hysterically, pleading with the officers, pleading with the reporters, trying to shield her face from the cameras with her free hand. It was a pathetic display of a woman who had built her entire life on a facade of superiority, finally crashing into the concrete reality of consequences. The officers did not negotiate. They firmly escorted Julianne away from the stage, leading her through the gauntlet of flashing cameras and shouting reporters toward a waiting cruiser. Simultaneously, Beatrice was hoisted out of her chair by a member of her own diminished legal team who had rushed forward from the back rows. They pushed their way through the aggressive media swarm, shielding her face with a jacket, leading her toward a black SUV idling near the side exit. I stood at the podium watching them retreat. I watched the two women who had tried to leave my mother homeless, who had tried to send my brother to prison, who had mocked my background and attempted to steal my life's work, get dragged away in total, absolute disgrace. They had thought they were the architects of my destruction. They had believed their money and their country club connections made them untouchable. They were wrong. The trap they had built for me had become their own gallows, and they had walked right up the steps and pulled the lever themselves. The payoff was complete. It was brutal, it was logical, it was 100% legal, and it was entirely satisfying. The cancer was excised. The ground was finally clear. The sirens faded into the distance, carrying Beatrice and Julianne away from the Vanguard Center. The chaotic energy in the courtyard shifted. The frantic flashing of press cameras slowed, settling into a focused, steady rhythm. The crowd of reporters and high society donors stood in stunned silence, processing the sheer surgical precision of the takedown they had just witnessed. I did not give them time to linger on the spectacle. I turned my attention away from the empty spaces in the front row and looked out at the people who actually mattered. The parents gripping the hands of their autistic children, the community advocates, the educators waiting to change lives. I reached for the giant gold scissors resting on a velvet cushion beside the podium. The metal felt cool and heavy in my grasp. I stepped down from the raised platform and walked toward the thick red ribbon stretched across the mahogany doors. The mayor of Boston stepped aside, giving me the floor. I aligned the blades against the fabric. I squeezed the handles. The thick material separated with a crisp, satisfying snap. The silence shattered. A roar of applause erupted across the lawn, rolling outward like a physical wave. It was not polite golf clap applause. It was a thunderous, deafening surge of genuine triumph. I handed the scissors to the event coordinator and turned toward the front row. I bypassed the empty chairs where my enemies had sat and walked directly to Helen. My mother stood up, leaning on her cane. The lines of worry that had aged her face for the past 30 days were gone. She pulled me into an embrace. Her grip was strong, unyielding. "We took our house back," she whispered against my shoulder. "We took the whole block," I replied. I stepped back and looked at Liam. My brother pulled me into a hug, resting his chin on my head. He was safe, his career intact, his future secure, because we refused to let Julianne use him as a shield. Maya stood beside him, holding her leather briefcase. She did not offer a hug. She offered a firm, decisive handshake. The grip of a general acknowledging a flawless campaign. "That is how you execute a hostile takeover," she stated, a sharp smile playing on her lips. We stood together in the morning sun. This was my family, a unit defined not by genetic obligation, but by unwavering loyalty and calculated action. The venture capitalists who provided the bridge loan approached, shaking my hand and confirming their ongoing support for the foundation. The reporters, instead of chasing the police cruisers, turned their microphones toward me, asking about the new curriculum and the future of the academy. I answered their questions with measured professional grace, shifting the narrative away from the scandal and securing the spotlight for the children who needed it. The timeline shifts forward. I sit behind a sleek, modern desk in my new office. The dark, oppressive wood paneling of Beatrice Sterling's former sanctuary is gone. The heavy oil paintings of arrogant founders have been replaced by vibrant artwork created by our incoming students. Sunlight streams through expansive floor-to-ceiling windows, bathing the room in natural warmth. Outside those windows, I can see the new inclusive playground. Children are running, climbing, and interacting in an environment designed specifically for their sensory and mobility needs. The sound of their laughter drifts through the glass. It is the sound of a $5 million federal grant being put to its exact intended use. I look down at my desk. A thick manila folder rests in the center. It contains the finalized property deeds, the operational blueprints, and the confirmed enrollment roster for the incoming class. The empire is stable, funded, and secure. I lean back in my leather chair, crossing my arms. My voice echoes in the quiet room, carrying a steady, resonant power. People often dispense a very specific type of advice when you have been wronged. They tell you to take the high road. They tell you to let go of the past, to forgive and forget in order to heal. They insist that holding on to anger is a poison that only damages the vessel carrying it. I fundamentally disagree. Do not let go of the things they said to you. Memorize them. Catalog every insult, every dismissal, every moment. They looked down at you and calculated your worth as zero. Remember the exact tone of their voice when they told you that you were not built for success. Take that raw, condensed humiliation and internalize it. Do not let it break you. Let it harden. Use their contempt as the combustible fuel required to build your own engine. For 20 years, I carried the weight of a teacher telling my mother I was destined for the bottom. I carried the sting of a sister who viewed me as collateral damage for her social climbing. Society conditions the family scapegoat to accept the blame, to shrink into the shadows, to apologize for taking up space. It is a psychological trap designed by narcissists to keep you paralyzed while they extract your resources. You break the trap by recognizing the game. If they tell you that you do not belong in their elite circles, do not waste your breath arguing. Do not beg for a seat at their table. Do not try to prove your worth to people committed to misunderstanding you. Instead, you secure the capital. You leverage your network. You buy the banknote holding the mortgage to their table. You purchase the very building they are standing in, and then you hand them an eviction notice. Your value is not determined by the words falling out of the mouths of corrupt relatives or arrogant educators. Your value is defined by your actions. It is defined by your capacity to outthink, to outmaneuver, and to outlast the people who try to bury you. It is established the moment you pick up a pen and sign the deed, claiming ownership over your own life. The psychological dynamic of the golden child and the scapegoat relies on the illusion of power. Julianne believed she was untouchable because she married into wealth. Beatrice believed she was invincible because she controlled an institution. They both relied on intimidation and the assumption that I would fold under pressure. But intimidation only works if the target is afraid of the consequences. When you strip away the fear, when you realize that the worst thing they can do is exclude you from a family you never truly belong to, anyway, you become incredibly dangerous. You become free. I stopped seeking their approval and started auditing their vulnerabilities. I stopped reacting to their emotional manipulation and started tracking their financial liabilities. The moment you shift your perspective from seeking validation to executing strategy, the entire power dynamic inverts. You stop playing their game and force them to play yours. And my game ends with federal indictments and seized assets. I look down at the file folder on my desk. The name Vanguard Center for Neurodiverse Excellence is embossed on the cover in silver lettering. I run my hand over the smooth paper, feeling the tactile reality of the empire I built from the ashes of their arrogance. I did not just survive their attempts to destroy me. I utilized their greed as the exact mechanism to fund my vision. I turned their corruption into a sanctuary for the vulnerable. A genuine, unburdened smile spreads across my face. The tension that lived in my shoulders for 2 decades is entirely gone. I reach forward and close the folder with a sharp, definitive snap. I look out over the courtyard one last time before pulling the blinds. The sunset casts long shadows across the playground where the golf green used to sit. Beatrice and Julianne are no longer even ghosts in this building. They are merely erased footnotes in a federal court docket. Building this sanctuary out of the ruins of their greed taught me things you can never learn in a standard classroom. It taught me the brutal mechanics of survival and the architecture of true power. First, I learned that biology is the greatest con ever sold. Society conditions us to believe that blood ties demand infinite forgiveness. We are instructed to absorb betrayal simply because the knife is held by a sibling or a parent. I reject that premise. Loyalty is a daily contract. It is earned through mutual respect and revoked the second someone views your empathy as a vulnerability. If your family requires you to shrink so they can feel tall, they are not your family. They are a liability. Severing that tie is not a tragedy. It is the necessary surgical removal of a diseased limb so the rest of the body can thrive. Second, I learned the terrifying advantage of silence. The most fatal mistake my sister and my former teacher made was broadcasting their arrogance. They needed an audience for their cruelty. They needed to gloat and posture. I let them have the stage. While they were busy performing for the local elite in a coat check room, I was reviewing audit logs and securing venture capital in the shadows. Never interrupt your enemies while they are digging their own graves. Let them assume you are weak. Let them believe you are defeated. A predator does not roar before it strikes. It holds its breath, blends into the environment, and waits for the target to step directly onto the trapdoor. Third, I learned that your inherent worth is never determined by the people trying to exploit you. For years, I carried the weight of an educator telling my mother I would never amount to anything. I let their biased perception define my ceiling. But value is not a label a corrupt authority figure pins to your chest. It is a deed you sign yourself. If the establishment tells you that you do not belong at their polished mahogany table, do not pull up a folding chair and beg for scraps. Buy the entire commercial property and dictate who gets to walk through the front door. I pick up my briefcase and turn off the office lights. The halls of the Vanguard Center are quiet now, but tomorrow they will be filled with children who will never be told they are destined for the bottom. I built an impenetrable fortress out of the stones my enemies threw at me. You possess the exact same capability. Thank you for listening to my journey on Hazel Tells Stories. If you found power in this narrative, drop a comment and tell me which of these 3 lessons resonated with you the most. Hit that subscribe button, and remember, your silence is never a surrender. It is your strongest weapon. I will see you in the next one.